right. Good morning. My name is Dennis Nixon. I'm the director of Rhode Island Sea Grant. I'm very excited to be the one kicking off this day today. We've been looking forward to and planning for this day for a long time to make sure that we had all the right people in the room. And looking around, I think we've done a great job of getting a lot of those right people in the room to talk about one of our Narragansett Bay. First off, this is the 16th annual Baird Symposium, and it's named after a very prominent individual by the name of Dr. Ron Baird. Ron, wave your hand here. Ron, out in front. Thank you. Ron is an accomplished scientist who served as director of the National Sea Grant Program for many years. In fact, they were some of the best years that Sea Grant has ever enjoyed. And in his retirement for that position, Ron continues to work with us at Rhode Island Sea Grant to make sure we're doing things the right way. So we appreciate his continuing guidance and help with this symposium. Sea Grant has been around for 50 years, and Sea Grant has been focusing its research attention on Narragansett Bay for that entire period. If you had a chance to look at the bibliography that was assembled by Jen and her team on the various research studies and articles that have been published about Narragansett Bay with Sea Grant-funded research efforts, it's an incredible array. And we look at the problems over those 50 years, it's quite clear that Narragansett Bay was a complex ecosystem when we started studying it 50 years ago with Sea Grant funding, and it's just as complicated today. What's interesting for us now, and the reason why we believe it's such an important topic to convene everyone together, is because of the fact that there are some new factors coming into play that we don't fully understand. Climate change, much more evident, ocean acidification, learning more about migratory habits of particular species. These are all complicating the questions in ways that we don't fully understand. And that's why today is so important, because we've brought together the best science that we know about Narragansett Bay today, and we brought together, I suspect most of you representing users of Narragansett Bay who were on the water, in the water, observing what's going on. And it's important there be some cross-referencing, that there be a conversation between users and researchers. And it's also very important for Sea Grant and certainly for the about to be started Narragansett Bay Special Area Management Plan, help us set the research questions for the future. As director of Rhode Island Sea Grant, I set aside a part of this year's funds simply to focus on research problems that come out of today's discussion. So the emphasis you'll hear throughout the day on developing good research questions is our ongoing homework through the day, if you will, helping us set the agenda for what we will be funding in the future, what areas of research we think need further attention as we learn from each other. So that's our exciting agenda for the day. I couldn't be more excited to be with all of you, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Corliss, the Dean of the Graduate School of Oceanography. He's a graduate of this fine place and has been looking at it for many years as well. Dean Corliss.
Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to welcome you all to the Graduate School of Oceanography this morning and to the Narragansett Bay campus. I'd like to first acknowledge and thank Director Nixon, Jennifer McCann, Monica Cox, and the Rhode Island Sea Grant group for their hard work to put this important workshop together. I also want to thank you all for coming out today to contribute to the discussions that we will have throughout the day. In thinking about the workshop today, I was reminded of a story from the writer Gertrude Stein. And the story goes that while she was on her deathbed, she turned to her companion and asked, "What is the answer?" Hearing no reply, she said, "In that case, what is the question?" Our workshop today will focus on both questions and answers of Narragansett Bay and hopefully contribute to this discussion. My interest This question and this workshop began about 2 years ago with a conversation from Al Eagle and some of his colleagues on the condition of the bay. So I'm very pleased that we've been able to have put this together for everyone. Over the years, Narragansett Bay has evolved. Since the last glaciation, it began as a stream bed, was flooded with rising sea level to create Narragansett Bay, and since that time has changed and evolved in somewhat of a continuous fashion. For those of us with a 40 to 50 year time perspectives, we can remember a bay that is quite different from what it was back in the past. During that time, the University of Rhode Island has provided answers and perspectives on Narragansett Bay. College of the Engineering, College of Environment and Life Sciences, the Coastal Institute, and the Graduate School of Oceanography, including the Coastal Resources Center, the Rhode Island Sea Grant, and the faculty, staff, and students of GSO have addressed important issues dealing with the evolution, change, and health of the bay. Our role is to provide the best scientific and management information to Rhode Island and the many stakeholders involved in Narragansett Bay, and to facilitate those discussions of the bay. This workshop today continues that tradition, and it's one that we also will continue in the future. So today's workshop, what are the questions? What are the answers? I look forward to our discussions and hope you enjoy the day as well. Thank you.
I'm not hiding, don't worry. Thank you very much. My name is Jen McCann, and I'm here at the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center and the Rhode Island Sea Grant College Program. And normally I stand over there and talk really loud, but today I'm happy to say that we've had so much interest and passion for this day that we actually have a spillover room in the 100 seated auditorium over across the way at the Coastal Institute auditorium, and we're streamlining that, so if everyone could wave to the people. I don't know where the camera is, but you are being watched, so watch out what you do with your hands today. So again, this is a very exciting day, and as the Dean and Dennis mentioned, this is an opportunity for citizens, resource users, scientists, managers to really talk to each other and to try to understand where each other's coming from, and also to understand what expertise we all share and what we all have. I want to say that I got several emails saying, hey, I have a presentation about this about Narragansett Bay, and I have a presentation about this, and the point is if we wanted to have an event, a comprehensive event about Narragansett Bay, this would be a month-long event, if not longer. Okay, so the reason why we're talking about these specific issues is these are the burning issues. These are the issues that were keeping our stakeholders up at night, especially the fishing community, asking these questions. Why is our bay changing, and why are these things happening to our bay? So this is why these topics are being discussed here. You know, the other thing is as you probably all know, the Coastal Resources Center, we travel all around the world, and we work with communities just like Rhode Island, just like URI, on making their places a better place. And you know, you go around the world, and we are really lucky here in Rhode Island. We have people who are so passionate and who really care about Narragansett Bay, whether it's because of a personal reason or from a professional reason, whether you're making your living from the bay, or you're researching the bay, you're studying the bay, or you're recreating on the bay. It's really important for all of us, and we have programs. We have, believe it or not, we have several funded programs whose sole purpose is to care and improve the management of Narragansett Bay. So that's really critical, and that's important to recognize. So for our little icebreaker activity, I'd like you all to raise your right hand high. Okay? Is anyone around you, actually, you're just doing it. I didn't tell you why, right? So put it down again. So I'd like you to raise your right hand if you care about Narragansett Bay. Okay, is anyone's hand down? Dave, get that up there. So, and I want you to look, no, keep it up there. So I want to see, is anyone around you, look around you, see if you know, is there anyone you don't know that you're sitting around? Okay, think about that. So I want you to, if you, right around you, I want you to extend your hand to someone you don't know very well and say, thank you for caring for Narragansett Bay. Okay, great. And I am not Catholic. I did not pick that up at church, so I just want you to know that. And I wanted to start the day by saying we all care about Narragansett Bay. We care about the future of our bay. We may think there's different things wrong with it or things could be improved, but that's the essence of this group right here. We care about the bay. And again, as we've heard, the purpose of today is to identify research questions. They may be questions, you might come up with a question that's already been answered, but that just means you don't know the answer. And that's okay because you represent, I know we have a certain percentage of Rhode Islanders here in the auditorium already because we're so small in Rhode Island, but the point is you are representing many more people in Rhode Island who don't have that answer as well. So we're going to talk about these questions. We're going to try to answer some of these questions, and then we're also going to talk about how we can move this conversation forward. The intent of this day is not to just sort of, we have failed if you're driving home and you're saying, well, that was a waste of a day, I didn't learn anything, okay? What we want you to do is to drive home and say, wow, I learned something, I met somebody new, and yes, I know where my research question is going, or I have hope, okay? So that's what our goal is in shaping this. So we did a little pre-survey, which of course only some of you took, but I think it is reflective of this audience. We have graduate students, and we have researchers, we have commercial fishermen, we also have recreational fishermen, and we have a retired high school teacher here. We have people in marine trades. We have the gamut here in the room, which is very exciting. The other thing is what we found out is most people who are in this room have had a longer relationship with Narragansett Bay than they have had with their spouse. Okay? So that's saying something, all right? You guys care about the bay. You have had a relationship with the bay, all right? Remember that, okay? Remember all the talks you've had with the water and the walking along the beach and making good money off of the bay and really enjoying it, okay? The other thing we asked is, what is your biggest concern about the future of Narragansett Bay? We have Melvin Alvarez, who's this amazing graduate student who's come into my life and is making my PowerPoints much more interesting, so I can't take credit for this. But basically, this is called a word cloud. So, and what we did is we took your questions, your responses, and we put them into a word cloud. Basically, in a nutshell, and we're glad to share these results with you, is that your biggest concern is around marshes and habitat. It's about climate change and sea level rise. It's also about excessive nutrients and algal blooms, among other things. You see user conflicts. You have, all different sorts of things, floods, pollution, all aquaculture. So there's lots of, it's too clean. There's lots of things that have come up that there's lots of concerns about this relationship you're having with the bay, which we're not going to talk about. So the other question we have is, what does resilient Narragansett Bay look like to you? So we recognize that we want to say, okay, well, where are we moving towards? What do we want the bay to be? And of course, we want climate change readiness. We want pollution-free, and we want balanced human use. So we want a clean environment, but we also want to be climate ready, which is cool, okay? And we want to be pollution-free. So to some degree, we want it all, and we're going to get it, okay? If we work together. The other question, and there's only one or two left, is what do you want to learn from this Baird event? We wanted to make sure that we were on task, and clearly people want to understand user perspectives. So we have organized an agenda where you're going to hear different people's perspectives. But it's also up to you all. Again, you just shook the hand. You probably just got a cold from somebody you don't know, okay? So the point is, it's up to you to also reach out and talk to these different people and understand where are they coming from? What are their questions? We are going to talk a bit about the state of the bay and looking at trends and whatnot from way back, thanks to Steve Hale in particular. So it's going to happen today. I need to put this up. You know, again, it's called thoughtful listening, all right? Wait your turn, all right? These are all the things you learn in school or from your family, all right? Listen. You don't have to just talk. Listen to what people are saying. Try to empathize, okay? Who remembers this from elementary school? Who tells their kids to do this? And who does this? Okay? So this is hard. This is really hard to do, and we're going to do that today. The other thing I just want to mention about these research questions is we have a lot of people in the room. If you're kind of going, ooh, a research question, that's too academic, okay? I can't do that, all right? There's a lot of people in the room who can help you shape that research question. So you just have to go up to them and say, you know, I have this idea. I'm really concerned about this. And those people will sit down and help you craft an agenda, a question. Okay? Raise your hand if you think you can help someone to craft a research question. Okay, so there you go. All right, the other thing is we are all in the same boat. All right? No matter where we're sitting. And the point is if one of us doesn't get it, if one of us is having a problem with this, then we're all going to sink. All right? So we need to all band together and make Narragansett Bay better. Not great again. Great, better. Okay? So well managed, improved quality. Okay? Are we all committed to doing that today? Yes. What? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. So with that, we're going to start with the first research panel. Not the research panel, the first panel of stakeholders. So Azure, can we bring your group up?
Sure. So, if I can have Mason and Al, and Mike, and Matt, come on up. Please come on up. Have a seat, guys. So I just want to welcome our first panelists today. We're going to have an hour to hear their perspectives. Today we have Mason Silks from Wastewater Farms, family-founded business. Dad is in the room too, which grows oysters and mussels in the bay. Mason, is there enough chairs, guys? There's one on this end too. Feel free. You can shift your. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Got it.
We'll have to shift.
Yeah, let's put some more light.
So Mason, welcome. We also have Mike McGivney, who's the president of the Rhode Island Shellfishermen's Association, who represents much of the wild harvest shellfish industry in the state. Welcome. Matt Griffin, who is a researcher at Roger Williams University and also a shellfish farmer. We have Al Eagles. Thanks for joining us, Al. And Lanny Dellinger, who are both from the Rhode Island Lobstermen's Association, representing between them decades and decades of experience fishing on the bay and working with researchers on projects. So welcome to you all. just said, the intent here with you all is this is a conversation. Think of this as a conversation, not formal, elaborate presentations. Obviously, we don't have PowerPoints, and we're amongst friends. So think of that just as you take a deep breath. The second is, remember, like Jen and Dennis said, the goal isn't to sort of solve all the problems or issues you might feel the Bay is facing, but rather to just sort of identify them. So just kind of remember that, and in each of your remarks, like Jen said, think of describing to us the changes you've seen. What are your sort of biggest concerns or issues? And tell us, from your perspective, what a resilient bay looks like. So, resilient is a sort of big word that we all use, and it's defined in different ways. But think of resiliency as a sort of the capacity or the ability of the ecosystem to adapt to changes. So sort of think of it in that term. So describe to us what a resilient bay would look like to you. And also what research questions you think are important. And again, like Jen said, we can help you sort of shape those. And to sort of also emphasize Jen's ground rules, remember it's important to express yourself, but equally as important to listen to others. We will, with that flip chart, kind of write down key topics that you're identifying. So every once in a while, glance over to that and make sure that the person before you, if they already said something that was important to you, you can maybe say, I agree with that, but you don't have to kind of go into, you don't have to repeat what someone else said before you. Remember that. And also, and this is where it's just so tricky, we wish we had a month, but since we don't, we all have valuable stories and experiences that shape who we are and what we know, right? That's what makes us. But today, if you could sort of, instead of telling us a lot of details about that story and that experience, think of that story and that experience and tell us what your research question is. Tell us how you think the Bay could be more resilient. Tell us what your issue is. You know what I mean? So try to incorporate that, and that's a really tough thing to do. We're here to help you to do that. And again, just be patient and kind to each other.
I should have been doing that. So I was just giving a few ground rules for our first panel. And with that, I'm going to ask Mason if you could begin. You guys will have 5 minutes. Again, it's about 25 minutes in total, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. If you could begin, Mason, and just give us, before you start, give us kind of your personal connection to the Bay, your perspective. Go ahead.
My name is Mason Sims. I work on a shellfish farm in Narragansett Bay. We actually have 2 farms in the bay and one out front of Newport. Trying to figure out how to grow in the offshore environment, which I think is important because the bay is so big. Can you hear me through this microphone? Is that
Bring a little bit closer.
And it is on. It just doesn't.
hello?
Yeah.
It is.
This is the one we're using for the streaming, but you really just got to speak loudly for the room.
Okay.
Okay?
Is it on now? Yeah, that's better. Okay. Also, we have a shellfish processing plant in the Quonset Business Park. So my personal connection with the Bay is I've been working on it for 10 years, 5 years full-time after I graduated from URI. And I don't know, I need to have a clean bay in order to, grow the shellfish and grow the businesses. My idea of a resilient bay is essentially it needs to have a variety of uses. It needs to have clean water first and foremost, and robust fisheries. It needs to have shipping industries. I think a resilient bay is a varied bay, like a diverse ecosystem and economic ecosystem. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Mike, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Mike McGivney. I'm president, as mentioned, Rhode Island Shellfishermen Association. I've been a commercial shellfisherman for the last 40 years after graduating URI in 1980. And I've been lucky enough to be president of the Shellfishermen Association for the past 22 years to represent all the hardworking Rhode Islanders. But my personal connection goes way, way back, and I think it's important to see what the Bay has been to people and the economy and the different generations of Rhode Islanders. My great-great-grandfather, Herbert Rice, was a scalloper in East Greenwich at the late 1890s. And it was so productive back then, they named East Greenwich Scallop Town. And thousands of dollars were earned by the people there. And it was such an important part of the economy to Rhode Island that the state put his scallop boat that he built and all its implements and sent it to the Chicago World's Fair of 1896, I believe. And it was to represent Rhode Island ingenuity. So even back 130 years ago, and even farther, obviously, the Narragansett Bay was important to the economy, to the people. In the 1920s, my family relatives had leases, oyster leases in upper Narragansett Bay that turned us into an incredible economy. In the 1950s, when people were coming back from World War II, the bay was there for the core hoggers, and really that's kind of when the shellfish core hogging industry started. My great uncle Jimmy Rice was a union representative for the United Mine Workers. We were actually a union bay back then, and there was that many people that were doing it. I grew up in East Greenwich, and as a kid, my dad would take me down to the local dock down in East Greenwich. We'd fill a bucket full of flounders in an hour, eels, everything. When I was 12, I bought a small boat with my paper route money, and we could go out and catch skipjacks and fill your boat up. There was squetig, there was stripers. The bay was just full everywhere. It wasn't until the late 70s that I started shellfishing, and then it was really just turning into a larger industry due to technological increases. Wood skiffs were being put aside with fiberglass. And then really that's kind of the modern day shellfishing industry happened. Water quality was the biggest issue back then. We had no access to the upper bay, Rocky Point, so the whole fleet was confined to the lower bay. But in the early 80s, due to water quality improvements, we really were allowed to go into this area, and that's when things started happening in my industry. Hundreds and perhaps thousands of shell fishermen really showed up and worked the bay. So the bay has evolved and it's changed, but it's always been productive. It's always been an important part. We're now seeing changes, due to the fish kill and the nitrogen reduction that I think are seriously adversely affecting Rhode Island, the bay. And the lack of food in the bay has caused the water to be cleaner, but we're concerned that there's not enough food for the shellfish to be productive. I read Scott Nixon's paper back 8-9 years ago about Fish and Wildlife's concern about the nitrogen reduction that was being proposed. And his paper had some dire consequences of the lack of nitrogen and its consequences. I talked to Mark Gibson from Fish and Wildlife about this paper and whether or not Fish and Wildlife was consulted on this paper and asked to consult on the nitrogen reduction, and he said no, they weren't. So that was my first worry, that there wasn't kind of one side checking the other on what we were going. So this is really a good time for my industry in that the water quality improvements, the bacteria that they're taking out of the water is allowing us to get access to areas that we haven't got to, in some cases historically ever, where we have the upper bay opening in the spring. But the concern is you have one hand, the water's getting better, but is there enough food in the thing for the fish to continue to thrive? So really it's kind of a dichotomy. Is clean water really a productive water, a healthy bay? And really that would be my concern going forward. Is there a certain level of nitrogen that the bay needs? And I think it was illustrated last year by the drought we had, no non-point sources, that we had a toxic algae bloom that we never had before. Is one group going to outpush another group? Is there enough algae in the bay to feed the shellfish? So these are all concerns that we have going forward, and we're glad and happy that they're addressing this in this format. Thank you.
My name's Lanny Dellinger. Sure, if you could put that up. I was longtime president of Rhode Island Lobstermen's Association. Still a lobsterman and crab fisherman. Years ago, I used to fish extensively in Narragansett Bay. In the last, 12 years or so, I had to give up on fishing Narragansett Bay because the productivity has gone down so much that there's no way for a person to make a living in my fishery. In the crab and lobster fishery is pretty much gone in Narragansett Bay, and I've watched, like Mike said, thousands of fishermen, whole businesses just go out of business. Some have tried to relocate and move outside, so we've pretty much lost, in my opinion, other than what's left of the shellfish industry, Rhode Island's greatest seafood resource was Narragansett Bay. Not that long ago. There was, millions of dollars, thousands of people employed. You can go out in Narragansett Bay in the summertime now when it used to be very active, and you're hard pressed to find anybody out there working anymore. And I started to watch some of my friends. I could go on for a list a mile long of guys that I knew that fished up there, that spent their whole life, sent their kids to school and bought homes. They've all been, they're all out of business, essentially, is what happened. And I started thinking about what is going on. I look at Narragansett Bay. To me, is a spawning ground. It's an estuary that all fish would come in the summer. That's where they go to spawn. It was, every fish that visits here is here for a reason. It's to carry on its own like kind. And noticing things like the kelp was gone, eelgrass was reduced, greatly. Rockweed. I mean, you could drive just anywhere in Rhode Island, drive across a bridge, look down, and the rockweed would be this deep everywhere. Everywhere you look, it's all gone. And it seemed to be happening in sequence and with the timing of nitrogen reduction. I grew up on this bay as a kid, as a teenager, started my career after getting out of the service as a quahogger, dove for quahogs all around Narragansett Bay, Lower Bay, Upper Bay, everywhere. Went through the times Mike talked about in the 80s and 90s, and witnessed a lot of the stuff. And I used to see unbelievable amounts of life in Narragansett Bay in the 80s and 90s, and that seemed to start to change about the mid-2000s. You're not writing this stuff down, so it's hard to document exactly when these changes happened, but mid to late 2000s, things started to disappear. There was no more balls of kelp coming up on the ground lines. There was no more, rockweed, slowly. And it happened so slowly that it doesn't even dawn on you till you look back 10 years down the road and you go, what happened? Where is all this life I used to see? It's gone. So me and Al talk a lot. We're both on the same dock. And I started digging through all this old papers and trying to educate myself. I wrote, I read a lot of stuff from the late Scott Nixon, Wally Fluella. I've never met you, but I found you on the web and read a lot of your stuff about nitrogen, and picked up these little quotes, and you can see a lot of the stuff that, even a lot of the researchers had concern with what we were doing by going down this road, reducing nitrogen to that point. And, I know there's climate change. I'm not a climate change denier. This definitely has its effects on the bay, but we cannot blame everything, in my opinion. You can't blame everything that's wrong with Narragansett Bay on climate change. Quahogs, for instance, the lower bay of Narragansett Bay used to be one of the most productive spots for quahogs. We called it Area C. There was A, B, and C back in my day, but that was, there was quahogs that made a living right out here in Dutch Harbor, more than one. All the lower bay was a very productive area for quahogs. That's gone. There's nobody makes a living in lower parts of Narragansett Bay. Well, that same species of shellfish, Mercenaria, the northern quahog, is very prevalent and does very well in the Indian River in Florida. It's the same species of quahog, and it does very fine in warm water. So something's happened that we're losing productivity. And all the papers I read that Candace Oviatt did and Nixon, and they all had concerns about what would happen to the mid and lower bay by reducing nitrogen to the levels that we had in the upper bay. It's having dire consequences in the mid to lower bay. Those are my observations. I make my living on observations, and that's all any fisherman does. They go out, they do their job, they observe what they see, they react to it, and that's how you make a living. And I don't think you'll find a fisherman in Rhode Island who has any experience in Narragansett Bay that feels very comfortable with what they've been seeing in Narragansett Bay since this process has started. I have the same concerns. Mike hit it right on the head. Is a clean bay necessarily a healthy bay? I greatly appreciate, having a clean bay, but I'm more concerned about a healthy environment in an ecosystem. It's not about one species or another. We don't have any flounder anymore. We don't have all of our all of the fish species that were native to Narragansett Bay seem to be in trouble, whether it's blackfish, blackback flounders, lobsters, crabs, bay scallops. All of those species are in trouble. Blackback flounders thrived in New Jersey back in the day, okay? Much water warmers than we have here, so they should still be thriving here, even though we've experienced a 2-degree, somewhere around a 2-degree rise in temperature in the last 30 years. There's no reason for a lot of these species to disappear. I was just reading recently of some researcher, I forget the person's name, I'm not good with this stuff, that was doing eelgrass surveys. We had like a 40-something% reduction in eelgrass since 2005 in Narragansett Bay, yet the narrow river has had like a 45 or 47% increase in eelgrass in the same timeline. Shallower. Only difference I can come to is just, you know, my anecdotal observations is we don't have a nitrogen reduction program or a wastewater treatment plant contributing to what's going on in the narrow river. And you can see it in all the salt ponds. Kelp does well in the salt ponds. Eelgrass is doing good in the salt ponds. Narragansett Bay, you can't buy a piece of kelp anymore. Just a few years back, 10, 15 years ago, we would have balls of kelp as big as pickup trucks would come up on the ground lines in Narragansett Bay. Now it's all gone. That's my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Lanny, and we're lucky to have Candace Oviatt in the audience, who's going to be speaking later today and addressing some of her research findings, so that's great. We can have more of a conversation. We'll make sure you meet and shake hands, too. Matt, you want to give us your perspectives next?
Sure, I'm Matt Griffin. I've been growing shellfish in Rhode Island for the past 14 years, mostly on the science side of things, conducting aquaculture and restoration research, and have also been involved in numerous collaborative fisheries research projects, lucky enough with a lot of these guys here. But in the recent past, I've been transitioning into the commercial side of the industry. I have 2 small oyster farms, one in northern Narragansett Bay, inside Island Park at the northern point of Aquidneck Island, and one in the West Passage south of Rome Point. So from an aquaculture perspective, I certainly have seen some changes and do have some concerns, both on the social and biological side. You know, in Rhode Island, we've had over an 80% increase in oyster production since the 90s. You know, this has had positive ecological impacts, but the user conflicts is certainly a real issue. And a lot of this growth we've seen has been in the salt ponds, and some of those salt ponds are starting to near their 5%, you know, social carrying capacity, if you will. So folks are now moving into the bay and interested in leasing aquaculture sites into the bay, and we currently have the technology to grow oysters anywhere in the bay. So with this increase in potential infrastructure in Narragansett Bay, I think it's, you know, critically important that we actually nail down real user uses of the bay, both recreational, commercial, and ecological areas of importance. And hopefully the bay SAMP that's coming up provides an opportunity for the aquaculture industry to grow, but at the same time giving, you know, the other industries a voice to be heard as well. And biologically speaking, from my perspective at least, oysters grow great in the bay. Certainly see better growth in the northern bay than we do in the southern bay, which would be expected due to nutrient inputs. You know, so I personally haven't been concerned with the nitrogen inputs as of yet, but that's not to be said. You know, it's been documented that the primary productivity has been going down in Narragansett Bay, and that is of concern, particularly at the same time we're increasing our production of filter feeding bivalves. So at what point is there going to be a tipping scale there? Maybe not on a bay-wide level, but at least on a micro level in some embayments where you've got multiple farms kind of stacked up on top of each other. And, you know, we've all seen the increase in water temperature. We've got, or experienced about a 3-degree increase in winter water temperature since the 60s. And a lot of the pathogens and diseases affecting our shellfish populations proliferate in warmer waters. You know, we first saw dermo in Rhode Island in the 90s, and now you look around at most of our farms or wild populations of oysters, and dermo is fairly prolific and does cause some problems. It seems like, anecdotally in my observations, SSO, another disease affecting oysters, has been popping up in different areas with more frequency. So as our waters warm, I think it's important for the industry that we maintain a robust monitoring program to help understand the changes in these diseases and hopefully to understand or better understand some pathways of mitigation to ensure our product gets to the market. And you know, we've had some shifts in phytoplankton regimes that are of concern. It seems like the spring and winter blooms are becoming less intense and moving back, and this is a vital source of nutrients for our overwintering shellfish. And when the shellfish are overwintering, particularly the juveniles, you know, they are fairly susceptible to mortality. And if they're losing that nutrient source going into the spring when we have an onslaught of predation and other stressors, we might start to see some more mortality in our juvenile shellfish. And at least from my observations, anecdotally, it seems like the rust tides, the cochleidinium blooms that we see are becoming more prevalent and more pervasive in the bay. You know, this doesn't necessarily cause health impacts to humans, but it certainly can slow the feeding rates of our shellfish and slow the growth in a localized manner, and even cause some mortality in the nursery phase if it is prolonged enough. And then the pseudonychia we saw last year, that was the first time I've seen it, and maybe the first time we've seen it in the bay in a long time. That had clear impacts and shut down sales, both for wild harvest and for farmers for a couple weeks, so there was some economic loss. But I think just as importantly as that economic loss is the potential negative public perception of, you know, unhealthy shellfish coming out of our waters. So we've got a lot going on, and you know, we've got drastic reduction in nitrogen coming into our bay. We've got climate change upon us, and how these interplay with the phytoplankton dynamics, which are feeding our shellfish in the bay, is critically important to the wild harvest and to the farming industry. And I certainly can't put my finger on one causality or one potential solution. I don't know that any of us can. So, you know, I think it's really important that we're all sitting here and hearing each other's concerns with an open mind.
Thank you, Matt. Al, you want to give us your thoughts?
You hear me okay? I got laryngitis. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to lose my voice here or not, but I'm going to try and get through it here. My name is Al Eagles. I'm a commercial fisherman out of Newport, Rhode Island. I've been a commercial fisherman all my life. I've been doing it for a living for 45 years straight, and most of my experience is right on Narragansett Bay. But before I get into what I have to say about a resilient Narragansett Bay, I would just like to thank Dean Corliss for initiating this symposium. And it happened through a conversation we had together over in Newport at one time, and I told him my concerns about the bay and my observations. He was very gracious in saying maybe someday we could have a symposium. So that's why we're all here today, and I'd like to personally thank Dean Corliss for having the symposium. Thank you, Dean. And secondly, before I get going, I'd like to thank Jen McCann. She's done a lot of hard work to organize this and present it, and she needs a good round of applause also. Okay, that being said, like I said, I've been a fisherman all my life. I'm not a public speaker, so I'm going to try and do the best I can here. I don't even like being in these type of settings, so you'll have to bear with me if I'm not very good at doing this.
You're doing great.
I started fishing when I was 10 years old, lobster fishing. My father taught me how to fish. He was a commercial fisherman. He taught me everything about it, all the aspects of it, what it took to catch lobsters, how to build the gear, seamanship. He also taught me about my environment, how to respect my environment, and how to observe my environment. And I've been doing this all my life through the lessons that he taught me. I fished all through junior high school, high school. I fished after I graduated from college. I went to Mass Maritime Academy. I shipped out in the Merchant Marine. And in the vacations I had from when I was shipping out, I went back to fishing also, lobster fishing. And this time I went offshore lobster fishing. And I knew I was going to do this for a living right then when I saw how productive offshore was. So 45 years ago, I had a boat built, and I still have that same boat today, and I've still been fishing commercially since then. So I started offshore, and then some years later, I started fishing inshore. So I was doing both at the same time. I'd come inshore, and I'd fish all summer long, 90, 100, 110 days straight, 12 plus hours a day, and it was all in Narragansett Bay. So my experience is going back some 40 years of Narragansett Bay, and I know a lot of you people have spent a lot of time, you know, doing your education, going to school. I got my education in Narragansett Bay. and I've witnessed a lot of changes over the years. And I'm going to try and take a few minutes here and explain some of them to you because I think it's very important. Years ago, the bay was very rich with all kinds of resources. We had lobsters, abundant lobsters, crabs, and all kinds of fish species, all kinds of other organisms like barnacles, sea squirts, rosebuds, and I'm going to explain all that to you. So all of a sudden, we had these big, huge balls of kelp in the bay back in the 80s and the 90s, like Lanny explained, balls the size of pickup trucks. Well, all the kelp disappeared in the bay. I haven't seen a strand of kelp in Narragansett Bay in the last 10 years. We just saw some for the very first time this summer, and very little of it. And the east shore of Jamestown and over Rose Island was covered with rockweed. And you go up there and look now, and the rockweed's practically gone. And the rosebuds don't go on the traps of the buoy lines anymore. Yet you go out front, right outside of Newport, where you're open to the wide open ocean, and the rockweed is still very prevalent, and rosebuds are growing, and barnacles are growing. So there's a disconnect between the bay and the ocean right out front. And I don't believe it's climate change either, and I don't believe it's water temperature. The water temperature's gone up 2.9 degrees in the last almost, since 1960, I believe, till 2015. So in almost 60 years, it's only gone up 2.9 degrees. So you figure, look at half of that time in the 90s, the bay was the most productive area on the whole East Coast. We had the greatest population of healthy lobsters than any other resource had on the whole East Coast. And that's a very important fact. So when you look forward for the next 30 years, roughly, almost, the water temperature's only going up like 1.5 degrees, and we've had all the loss of all these different type of seaweeds, and also we've incurred shell disease in lobsters, which came in the late 90s. And it's getting worse by the year, believe it or not. I did a study last year, and we had a 67% incidence of shell disease in lobsters by the Newport Bridge. And when you go out front, there's very little shell disease, and the further offshore you go, there's no shell disease. So there's a situation, there's a problem there. Why are we having so much shell disease in Narragansett Bay? Nobody knows the answer to that question, but it's a good question to look forward to and ask. So the point that I want to bring up that is very important, the changes of the bay. We had a resilient, I believe is a resilient Narragansett Bay back in those 90s. Like I said, everything was flourishing. Today, as fishermen and observers of the bay, we do not see that same thing. And it really took place dramatically in the last 3 years. So you have to ask yourself, what took place in the last 3 years? Well, one thing that took place is the barnacles stopped growing on our traps 3 years ago. And I mean, when they stopped growing, after a year in the water, there was absolutely no barnacles on the traps at all. They looked like the delivery truck that just deliver them. Yet you go out front, and the gear we had out front, the barnacles were still growing on them. Also, there was no sea squirts, and what we call sea squirts, grapes. I don't know what the technical name is. That's what the fishermen call them. And these rosebuds. Nothing grew on the traps from in Narragansett Bay from the Newport Bridge north. And all these things were still growing on the traps out front. So talking to Lanny and some other fishermen, we said, we've got a real problem here in the bay. Something's taking place. And also at that same time, the water quality changed. In the bay in the summertime, you could go up on a Newport Bridge or Gould Island in August, and the bay would be brown. The water color would be brown. You couldn't see 1 foot through the water column. And if you scooped up a bucket of water, which I used to do all the time to clean my boat, and I still do it today, and in August, you'd scoop up a bucket of water, and it'd be full of life, little zooplankton swimming around, thousands of them in every bucket of water. And you go out front and you see the same thing. You go up Narragansett Bay right now, you can go up there, we did it this summer and last summer, and scoop up a bucket of water, and there was nothing swimming in it. The water was clear. And to me, that indicates you have a situation like you have the Narragansett Bay is turned into a swimming pool. You look in a swimming pool, and it's treated with chemicals, and there's no life in it. It's clear, you can see right to the bottom. You can go down to my dock right now in the summertime in August, and you can see right to the bottom, 15, 20 feet down. And all the meetings I've been to in the last 3 years, everybody is saying what a great job they've done cleaning up Narragansett Bay. And the one thing they always point to is how clear the water column is. And to me, that's the worst thing I can possibly see or hear from somebody. If the water's that clear, to me, it's dead. There's no life in it. Narragansett Bay is a marine estuary of national significance. It's supposed to be full of life, especially in the summertime. And as observers and fishermen, we're not seeing that. That's why we're trying to bring this attention to the symposium today. And I understand all the people have done very hard work in their agenda to cleaning up the bay. And they have. They've reduced fecal coliform, but they've said they've cleaned up the water column. And to me, that's not a good thing. I understand that they've tried to do a good thing, and the bay is swimmable, but it's not fishable. Like the Clean Water Act of 1972 says the bay has to be fishable and swimmable. Well, it used to be fishable, and now it's not anymore, but it is swimmable. So we have to ask ourselves, what has taken place in the bay, especially in the last 3 years, that's changed the bay from a resilient bay to what I call actually a dead bay? And it's sad to say, but a lot of us fishermen have a saying, when we're going to fish in the bay, we're going to Chernobyl. And that's a terrible thing to have to say. I mean, I love the bay. I've been on this bay all my life, over 40 years of fishing here. I respect it, but something drastically has changed in the bay, and we have to address it. And I hope that today, there are questions that get answered today, that we can go in the right direction to change the effect that's what's going on here in the bay, and we can bring it back to a healthy marine ecosystem. And there's a lot more I have to say, but I'm sure I don't have enough time to say it. I'd like to get into a lot of other things, but I'll end it at that, and I just want to say one thing. I feel that I'm a steward of Narragansett Bay. I feel responsible for the health of the bay as a healthy marine ecosystem, and I believe everybody in this room feels the same way I do. That's why we're here today. So we all have to put our heads together and do a good job here today with the symposium, and maybe we can turn this thing around. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well done. Great, thank you all. Before we open it up for questions, is there anything you all might want to add in terms of, we can go back to Mason, just a quick thought based, you've heard all of your colleagues and peers' comments. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add? Go ahead, Mason.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I work on a shellfish farm, and it's a suspended long line, and that essentially means that there's a pin on one end, a pin on the other end, and the gear floats. It's in about 30 to 50 feet of water, depending. And, our cages are made out of plastic. They're, they're 2 by 2 by maybe 4 feet tall. And when we put them in the water, everything grows like crazy in the bay off of Middletown. We put them in the water in, May to June, and the oysters grow really well that we put in there. By the middle of the summer, we're spending the entire day power washing, getting all the biofouling off. That's one of our biggest jobs, essentially, is to get the biofouling off so the oysters have enough, they have enough clean water flowing to them. And on the other hand, when we go to our offshore site and look at the oysters, the oysters in the bay, they grow maybe like a half an inch a month or a half an inch every couple of weeks. Whereas you go offshore in the site and they don't grow nearly as well. And I just think that's an interesting point, because it seems like they're seeing the exact opposite. And, I'm not sure really what happens there, but our stuff is growing like gangbusters, and that's fortunately for us. I just thought that was strange.
Great. Anything else anyone wants to add before we open it up to the audience?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one of the concerns that kind of brought me to this point, following up on this for, 4 years now, it seems like, is I'm watching the history or maybe that's better. I've just watched I'm afraid we're going to lose our fishing heritage in Rhode Island. If you look at the fishermen in the room, there's not a lot of them here, but if you look at the average age of a fisherman in Rhode Island, he's probably upwards of 60 years old. And like I say, not that long ago, it was only 15, 20 years ago, there was 1,000 people that would make a living off of Narragansett Bay, roughly somewhere in that neighborhood. And that number is probably less than 10% of that now, probably a lot less than 10% of that. A few more years, I mean, you look at a fisherman, you're looking at an endangered species in Rhode Island, especially in the inshore fisheries. You're always going to have the big boats, the sea freeze boats or whatever. They're going to go way off, and but the small inshore fisheries that people, tourism come down, they look at the docks, they come to Newport, and they want to see the fishermen and the lobster boats. And all. It's going to be gone. It's almost gone now. I think. DEM can back up what I'm saying. I mean, their licensing program is what funded, the whole marine fisheries division, and it's shrunken down to almost nothing. I mean, the licensing, I'm part of a committee they call the Industry Advisory Committee, and we go over licensing every year, and every year we're just watching those numbers. They're dropping like flies. So if we're not careful, I mean, this is kind of like, I've said it to Al, I'm done. I mean, I've been working on this for over 4 years, and I'd really like to see something come out of it positive, with people really be concerned about what we're seeing, what's going on with the bay and coastal marine environment. But it's not going to be much longer, and we're going to lose it. And that being said, I'll give it to somebody else.
Great, thank you. Mike or Matt, do you want to add any quick thoughts? Should we go?
Yeah, one of the terms one of the numbers I didn't pull out was, I was told 5 tons a day less nitrogen is going into the bay. So just imagine the biggest dump truck you can see, and it's full of food. We probably don't want all those 5 tons back in, but maybe timing them in the spring and allowing a greater amount of nitrogen in the water to help spur the things that need to be helped. But I think being too rigid on the amount of nitrogen is really just sending us in the wrong direction. So.
Great, so we've heard a lot of excellent insights. Thank you all for sharing those about nitrogen, primary productivity, both wild harvest, lobsters, shellfish, and also farming. So with all this in mind and these great perspectives, I want to we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, but I want to just sort of preface that let's not try to answer the questions on some of the concerns that folks have brought up here with our panel. So if you have additional insights and things you want to add to contribute, or a research question yourself, but let's not try to sort of solve and tackle some of these now. That's what this whole day is for. So I want to preface that first. But with that, anybody have a question for the panelists or something to add? We have 5 minutes or so. Fred. Hi, Fred.
Yes, hi. I'm a retired fisherman after 40 years and now president of the Research Foundation. I have a question in perspective. I think this is an excellent panel. I thought they did a great job, and I think we should give all of them a hand. Lot of experience there at that table, hundreds of years, just Alan alone.
Permission to kick him when he...
I think we're both the same age, though, Alan. But what I didn't see fin fishermen. And I haven't fished that bay since 70s and 80s. But I talked to a lot of fishermen that had fished the bay. And there's been a tremendous shift further south and off the coast, and not so much in the bay. And, Lenny touched on it. There were an awful lot of proliferation of blackback flounders. It used to be demersal species that were prevalent. We had blackback flounders, we had summer flounders, and they were prolific. Now, that migration in the spring and spawning that takes place, because I believe that's really what the healthy bay is, a great spawning ground. And that's necessary in order to have a sustainable fishery as those species spread out and build up in schools and then do this migration pattern back and forth. And that's what I think is happening. The problem I think we need to address is things that Alan was saying with the healthy ecosystem and habitat. Is it changing? Is the benthic community changing? Because I remember Jeremy Colley did a study, and he was talking about the shift, that it used to be demersals in the bay, and now there's more of a shift to a pelagic species. We don't see as many flounders, and we see more scup, butterfish, even squid. Now there's catching some squid there. I don't ever remember seeing squid in any abundance other than on the South Shore. So I think the same thing is happening with finfish, and I think it's important to address. Somehow something is happening to the ecosystem, and it's causing this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Any other thoughts? Go ahead in the back.
Can I add a comment to that?
Yeah, go ahead, Mason.
You know, like I said, I've only been on the bay for 10 years, but I talked to my dad who's been there a lot longer. In the past couple of winters, we've been seeing different species of whales, you know, whether it's a humpback whale was one year, there were several beluga whales one year too. And, you know, he said he had never seen anything like that in his, 30-something years of experience. So that's, yeah, I think the ecosystem is changing. I don't know, for the better or for the worse.
I'd like to add just one thing to that, and I think, Fred, you hit it right on the head. A lot of the reading I did, you know, whether it was Nixon's work or Candace Obiot's work, is the concern with the reduction of nitrogen was the major effects would be in the Bethany community. You know, when you're talking blackback flounders and the likes, I think that's where, you know, it may be an issue. I mean, that's something that we should get to think about from a research perspective and find out what the problem really is.
Excellent. We just have time for one more question in the back.
Manuel Sousa, can you hear? My name is Manuel Sousa, and I've been going out to the Gulf Cove. I'm with the Shellfish Advisory now, and I've been going out to the Gulf Cove in Portsmouth for 40, 45 years. And the way it has changed in that amount of time as far as the oyster population is incredible. We used to get, you know, half a bucket of oysters, pick them up at low tide along the shore, and it's the shore I'm talking about is parallel to Matt's shellfish farm and his oyster farm. So in the past years, it's down, down, down. I don't even take a bag out there anymore. I just shove a few in my pocket because I know I'm not going to get too many. Now, I've also looked at the way the Gulf Coast seems to be isolated a little bit from the rest of Narragansett Bay and Monhope Bay. There's an exchange of waters, but whatever's going on in the rest of the bay is also happening in Gulf Cove, and to me, that's the big mystery, is why it's not more prolific there. And in response to your this gentleman's about squid, under the causeway in the 70s and early 80s, there were so many squid coming through there that you could actually, you know, my uncle used to go down on the rocks and just pick them up and throw them onto the beach. He didn't even, you know, fish for them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And we're just out of time now, unfortunately, but I just want to give our panel a round of applause and one more time. And invite them to go, feel free to have a seat, and Pam will come on up. And just remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's plenty of opportunity to chat more. So, Pam, are you here, or Jen?
I can probably stand up and I'll have you move it along. That's okay. That's all right. I'll just stand up over there maybe and you can move.
Because I want to say
slides
playing
along
wrong,
for
I'm
me.
sure. I don't think so.
Oh, perfect. Is this to move the slides forward?
I'm probably going to be like.
Is there a laser built into
I
this?
thought that's what I was waiting for.
Okay, thank you. That's all right. I'll try to watch, look at it. Thank you. Hi, folks.
Good to be here with you.
Good, good. Oh, yeah. At least I'm going to be rushing it. Oh, okay.
Well, I can go for it. I thought it was on the list that Tom was going first. I'm happy to go
Okay,
whatever.
no, I can go first. That's fine. I'm first, all right. I will. I get like 60 slides, but I'm going to like zip through.
I have like 11.
Do you?
Good morning.
Good.
I don't have any.
Good for you.
Good morning.
We'll get shorter and shorter.
My name is Pam Rubinoff. My name is Pam Rubinoff from Rhode Island Sea Grant, the Coastal Resources Center here at the Graduate School of Oceanography. Really appreciate those folks that are in the back coming down. There's plenty of seats. I'm sure people will let you in. I'm really pleased to come after that last panel. Today, we welcome you to an impressive group, and most of them are yourselves. And so it really is quite wonderful to see that passion and commitment of everybody. And one person I also wanted to recognize who's not up on the panel today is Janet Coit, the Director of DEM, and many of the issues and management challenges and such are really looked at from the Department of Environmental Management, which she leads. So thank you, Janet. So today we have Tom Uva, the Director of Planning and Policy and Regulation at the Narragansett Bay Commission. He's one of our speakers, has a long history of connection here. We also have Wally Fulweiler, ecosystem ecologist and biochemist at Boston University. And then finally, as our rapporteur, somebody who's not going to rap, but she's going to be a rapporteur, Candace Oviatt, a professor of oceanography here at GSO, who has been focusing her career on coastal ecology. So before you guys start, can you just, Tom, just briefly tell us what your relationship to the Bay is, just in a sentence, each one of you?
In a sentence?
Yes, because you have 15 minutes.
Okay, well, I live the Bay.
Okay.
I was a shell fisherman when I was in college studying chemical engineering. Got hooked on the Bay as a kid, cohogging at Oakland Beach when I was about 4 or 5 and eating that stuff, and that's probably why I'm a little crazy.
Okay.
Because we didn't do water monitoring in those days, and I lived on a boat for 15 years and have about 4 boats now that I play around with, so
he
my
lives
life
the Bay.
is the Bay.
My
or
life
the
is the
oceans.
Bay. And Wally?
Well, I'd like to live in the Bay. So I came to Rhode Island when I was 5 and grew up on Narragansett Bay and found every excuse to be in, on, or under it. And it is by far my favorite spot on earth. So,
Great.
And then I did my graduate work here.
Thank you, Wally. And Candace?
I came here as a graduate student in the 1960s, and I've been studying the Bay ever since. It's not recommended you do this. You're supposed to come here and learn how to do that and then go put your expertise someplace else. But I put it here for that whole time.
Well, thank you. And the other thing that they all have in common is they are all graduates of URI, so very happy to hear that. So we did hear very clearly some of the issues from our fishing community and who are key users and leaders on the Bay about what they are seeing. Is a clean bay a healthy bay was one of the questions here. So our colleagues here are really, the role here is to provide a foundation for the next several presentations about the choices we have made. So, Tom. After they speak, we will have discussion.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to have to look at the slides here because I don't have a computer in front of me. But basically, I'd like to tell the fishermen it's not our fault at the Bay Commission that the fish are gone. Angelo, thank you. You're welcome. Okay. So basically, we all want a clean, fishable bay. We want a lot of fish. We want clean water. We want sustainability. And that's why we're here today, to try to figure out what we can do to ensure that. And there are a lot of issues in the bay. I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to go really fast. but we know about losing wetlands. We don't have eelgrass. We have contaminated sediment, climate change, changes in our bay fisheries. I'm going to go a little bit over the history of the bay fishery changes. In the mid-1800s, fish populations were incredible. We had Atlantic salmon, herring, smelt, scup, tautog, sea bass, cod, you name it, it was in the bay. Lobster and shellfish were abundant. Oyster yields in the late 1800s was incredible. There's a picture there of Scallop Town that Mike talked about. We had about 500 dams in the bay in the early 1900s. By the 1870s, the salmon fishery was gone. By the 1930s, herring fisheries were depleted. Eelgrass was dying from wasting disease. Scallops were on decline. And in the 50s, we had a lot of improved fishing technologies that hurt the fishing stock. Today we have over 700 dams. More than 50% of the salt marshes are gone compared to 300 years prior. Winter flounder was in decline, 90% decline since the 1980s. So that's definitely not nitrogen associated. We went from 10 million pounds down to 2 million pounds, and lobsters have been on decline since 2001. Oysters were the big thing in the Upper Bay. It was highly productive. This is a picture of Starved Goat Island. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. This is a picture of Starved Goat Island, which is where Save the Bay is today. That was the Pettit Oyster Farm. In 1903, the state was generating $45,000 a year in oyster bed leases, and it was a highly productive fishery. People started becoming sick due to bacterial contamination, and the fisheries really was declining by 1911. And the great hurricane of 38 was the final blow to the oyster population. This is what Providence looked like in 1650. The plateau on the right is where the State House is today, that's Smith Hill. And in 1880, you can see the changes in it. It was pretty industrial, and it was with a lot of development. The landscape has changed since 1636. I'm not going to dwell on all of these items. I'm going to hit on a couple of them, but they'll be in my presentation for you to look at. Jewelry industry, 1775. It was booming in Providence. In the 1700s, 78% of Rhode Island was forested. 1790 was the birth of the Industrial Revolution. Samuel Slater, Slater Mill. And 1800, we began a really rapid population growth in Rhode Island. It was increasing by 3.1% a year until about 1910. And by 1820, 54% of Rhode Island was forested. That was a low. It's actually a little higher now, about 59%. In the 1830s, 27 jewelry firms with 280 workers, and cotton mills and textile mills were on the rise. By 1850, we had 9,200 farms around the Narragansett Bay watershed, and they were clearing the land and causing sediment and nutrients to go into the bay. The river was first dredged in 1853, and in the late 1850s, the textile mills started using dyes that had heavy metals in them. And the jewelry industry was booming by the 1860s. Rhode Island was the most industrialized state in the nation until 1990. We also dominated the silver, machine tool, and costume jewelry industries. And today, if you sample the sediment, you can see that legacy in the sediment of those heavy metals. The 38 hurricane changed the state, changed the bay. By 1938, the bay was transformed mostly from a hard bottom to a soft bottom with a lot of siltation. And the Providence Hurricane Barrier was built in 1966, and that changed Flushing in the bay. And by 1970s, we were the jewelry capital of the world, with over 32,000 people working in the industry. And presently, the industry is in decline. Manufacturing is in decline in Rhode Island. And industries treat their waste and no longer discharge heavy metals to the bay. And we have, as I indicated, 59% of the state is forested. We have great open space protection in Rhode Island. It gives you a little picture here of the way it used to be in 1895 versus 1930. They were putting in the George Washington Bridge here at that time. And this is what Fields Point looked like in the 1800s. It was farmland, and there were docks, and there was fishing, and there was oystering, and shellfishing was the big thing in the harbor. Fields Point was noted for clam bakes and amusement parks. And the ships used to come right up the river and park at South Water Street. Hence, they had the name of the fish company, the local bar that some of us might have hung out at. And the river was a lot deeper then, so you could take 12 ships up into the river. Rivers now are all silted up. And these are some of the farms that were there, and this is also the picture that I showed you earlier of the river. And this was the Oyster Farms. This was Starved Goat Island, where Save the Bay is today, where Pettit had his oyster processing facility. And he processed the oysters and put the shells back in the water to make the island bigger. And Narragansett Oyster Bay Company was on the other side of the area. You can see the bridge in the back, the old railroad bridge that's still there on the Seekonk River, and just bales of oysters and barrels of oysters being collected there. When we put in phase 2 of the CSO tunnel, our tunnel boring machine went through rock like nothing, but it hit tons of oyster shells that was destroying the tunnel boring machine blades, which was pretty interesting. And this is Fields Point today. Pretty industrial, no picnic grounds, no shellfishing. We're a highly industrialized waterfront port with significant shipping. We specialize in scrap metal, and the piles are huge, and it's Rhode Island's largest export. And we store salt and import salt, and I wonder where all that salt winds up. Any idea? And we process coal. We bring in coal and we store it, and we spread it around, and it settles in the bay. And we store oil tanks, and we have oil tanks where we store fuel and LNG, and we have cement facility there, and we have a sewage plant, a university, environmental agency, and various other businesses in the port. But not much recreation and not much shellfishing. So things have changed over the past 100 years in the Providence waterfront. Environmental regulations are pretty new in Rhode Island. And basically we had a shellfish commission. I think they were probably around to collect taxes from the shellfishermen. And we had a bird commission and an inland fisheries commission. And they formed the Division of Fish and Game, which became the Department of Natural Resources, which became DEM in 1978. It's hard to believe that was only 1978 that occurred. And CRMC in 71 and the Clean Water Act in 72. And one of the successes is the reduction in metals. And metals have gone way down, entering the bay due to the success of the pretreatment programs. And back in the 1700s, the sewage was just kind of dribbling into the bay, and they realized they had to get rid of sewage, so they started to build a sewer system in 1870. And their sewer system had 65 outfalls, or direct pipes, that went to the rivers, what we fondly call today combined sewer overflows. And in the days, they had flushing of the waste off the streets and get it into the rivers. And they realized that that was bad for shellfishing, and so they started to build a sewage treatment plant, and in the late 1800s. And in 1901, they built the Providence Sewage Treatment Plant, and in 1908, it was processing and filtering sewage. And at that time, they used to take the sludge to east of Prudence Island and dump it. And that continued for many years. In 1912, they started to add bleach to disinfect. Okay, I'm going to fly ahead here. And this is a little history of the wastewater treatment. and I'm going to fly ahead. And clean water is very expensive. That's all I'm going to say there. And disinfection is very important. I know Angelo's going to talk about that, but you can see the decline in fatal diseases once we started disinfecting water and wastewater. And as a result of the CSO project, the bay is much cleaner. The upper bay can support beaches, and shell fishing areas are opened up, more fishing areas, and more days of fishing. And nitrogen pollution, I'll go a little bit into that. It increased significantly with population. And we spent a lot of money to build systems to reduce nitrogen. And overall, 11 treatment plants in the Upper Bay have achieved about a 64% reduction average over the past few years. The NBC is 66% reduction. We've actually reduced 82% compared to the 2003 fish kill loadings. And the questions raised about the grand experiment. Was this the right thing to do? And to quote Candace, would Goldilocks say a 50% reduction was just right? And only time will tell. We look at the National Coastal Condition Report to try to get an idea, and the DIN numbers look pretty good in the Upper Bay with this 50% reduction. And but rain still affects the DIN numbers, and the rain is still a problem. If we look at the history of the bay, what happened to the bay itself, this map from 1865 shows what the bay looked like. And it was interesting to hear the fishermen, because some water quality problems are localized. If we zoom in on this map, you can see eelgrass beds and oyster beds and wetlands. And this is Fields Point. And this is the original precipitation plant that was at Fields Point. And I already talked about the shellfish beds and the leasing of the beds. But the Providence River was dredged to 25 feet deep, and the Seekonk River was 37 feet deep. And that in red is the outline of what the river used to look like, or looked like in those days. And what was the flow circulation pattern in those days? Well, it hit this pinch point right about here, came around Starved Goat Island, where Save the Bay is today. It was only 25 feet deep, so the flow was much, much faster in those days. And this is what it looks like today. We filled in the bay. Starved Goat Island is at that point where Save the Bay is. The bay is 50 to 60 feet deep. The Seekonk River is much shallower, 6 feet in the center. If you go out of the little channel, you'll go aground with your boat. And the wetlands are gone. We built the hurricane barrier. We built Patuxent Cove barrier. We have this area called the gyre of low dissolved oxygen where pore flushing occurs. And the circulation comes down the bay. The jet of water that comes down the Seekonk and Providence rivers, forming this gyre, mixes with the nutrient-rich bottom waters from the Patuxent. And that's a big pump. Ram's model that we've done with Dr. Kincaid shows that water that's low in DO and nutrient-rich constantly is pumping dirty water into the bay. So, one of the things that we've proposed over the years is, can we use take a holistic approach and do some smart engineering to try to improve the circulation in that area. And selective dredging, and I'm going to zip through some of these. Can we remove the break wall? And I'm going to zip right ahead because I want to get to my closing. So can we build some wetlands? Can we do some selective, raise some spat in that nutrient-rich waters? We heard the fishermen say in the bay he's much more productive as shellfish. Can we use that to grow spat to transplant to other portions of the bay for the wild harvesters? So and can we fix the circulation? So those are some of the things we can do. Now, we also do some benthic monitoring in the Upper Bay, and I wanted to show you this. We want to see what the changes are in Upper Narragansett Bay, and this is some of the stuff that our benthic monitoring has revealed. The bay is alive. There is stuff up there. It's not sterile. We have all kinds of creatures up there, but one thing we do miss is structure. We don't have structure. We don't have eelgrass, and so there are opportunities to do some other things in the bay. There is a flounder in the bay. I don't know if that's the only one. There's a tog sleeping over there, a sea robin, We do see some menhaden. We see menhaden a lot. Our crews out there see fishermen pulling in stripers and bluefish all the time. And we do have visitors to the bay. We've had belugas that visit the past couple of years. I don't know if they're lost or they're just snowbirds coming down to enjoy the treats that we serve in the bay. Beluga whales and big pods of dolphins that have been visiting. And we have the seals that come here, and I don't know if they're eating all the lobsters or the flounder, but they're up in the bay every year. So we do have a lot of sea life in the bay, and you know, the bay has been negatively impacted by us over the past 350 years, and we continue to impact it, both negatively and positively. The water's cleaner than it's been in a long time, and I know we're going through a lot of changes in the bay, and the changes are rapid right now to clean up the bay, and they're very expensive. And I'm not Mr. Spock, so I can't mind meld with any of those whales and ask them what they're feeding on or why they're coming here or what they think about the bay, but I think that's what the scientists here today are going to try to help you answer. So, thank you.
So, as Tom pointed out, this has been a working estuary for a long time, and it's just been changing. So I think that that's the key element here. It's changing, and Tom showed some of that. Wally is going to provide us another perspective on some of these changes from the biological standpoint.
Well, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you. I get to talk with you twice today, so I'm sorry for that. And some of what I'm going to talk about will bear resemblance to what Tom just talked about. But I think that's okay, because I think the history of the bay is really important to keep in mind, and I think it's worth us going over that. Plus, I know from teaching a lot that people typically only hear about 10% of any lecture that's given, so I figure maybe your opinion is a good thing. So ever since I started talking to Jen about this particular topic and the name of this panel, the choices we've made, George Jones has been in my head constantly. And he sings this song. You guys know the song Choices? Maybe? All right. Well, it's a really good song. I won't sing it for you because I have a terrible voice. But in it, he has this one line about living and dying by the choices that we've made. I don't think that Narragansett Bay is dying in any way, but I do think that the choices we've made have caused some significant changes. And some of these are choices we've actively made, and some have been made sort of indirectly through larger scale regional processes. So I don't know if you have read The History of Metal Inputs by Scott Nixon, but it's actually a beautifully written piece of work, and so I suggest that you do. In it, there's one particular line I like where he says, "The history of Narragansett Bay has been the product of circumstances, large and small, of the geology of the watershed and the genius of individuals." Not bad for a history of metals. So, as we've heard today, Narragansett Bay has been impacted for a long time. And I think we need to sort of step all the way back, and we can begin to think about the Native Americans who use this land and spend a good deal of time not farming maize like we may have thought, but actually trying to use the water. They did a lot of burning of the land in order to get rid of sort of brush and have a type of forest that would have the product that we wanted. We know that Verrazano entered the bay in the early 1500s, and one question that Scott Nixon often used to ask was, could he see his toes, right? How clear was the water? And my guess is that it was quite clear compared to what we had in the past. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution hit Rhode Island in 1790, but it really wasn't until we began having the power loom and cotton mills later, after the War of 1812, that we really began to impact sort of much of Narragansett Bay. As late as 1865, there were beautiful and abundant, or I'm imagining that they were beautiful, zoster marina, eelgrass beds in the Providence River estuary. And you can see this here, this laser pointer. You can see up here, this is one of those maps where Webb went and did a big survey of the meadows in the Providence River estuary. But then, on Thanksgiving Day, with a 13-gun salute and the ringing of bells, we began to pump water through the city of Providence. Up until this point, all of our waste, all of the horses, all of the farm animals, all of that waste was staying on the land. But as soon as we added water to the system, then we began to take all of those products and all of those nutrients and flush them into Narragansett Bay. The change was pretty rapid, so if we have this in 1871, the water began flowing. By the early 1900s, there's a quote here that talks about how beautiful the beaches around Fields Point were, and then how gross and slime-covered they became. And that was because of that rapid input of nutrients into the bay. Another way to think about this and look at this is to talk about the amount of water, so that's the open circles here over time coming into the bay, and the dark circles are the sewage, and we're looking at the average flow. So Narragansett Bay is unlike many of the estuaries that we're used to thinking about, like Chesapeake Bay, for example, or Pamlico Sound, where we imagine that the nutrient inputs are coming in and they rapidly and exponentially increase over time. In fact, if we use these dark dots, or these dark dots here for sewage as the amount of nitrogen entering Narragansett Bay, you can see that by the mid-1950s or 1960s or so, it actually flattened out. And that's because, unlike other estuaries where there was lots of non-point source pollution and a really rapid increase in the amount of people in the estuary in the watershed feeding into the estuary, Narragansett Bay and the Providence River estuary were really, the population there began to kind of even itself out. So the number of people coming in, as well as people going on sewage, was sort of even. So Narragansett Bay has had basically, up until our major mitigation recently, has had the same amount of nitrogen entering the bay since the 1960s or so. So that's very different than other estuaries. I think this bears, we need to think about this a lot. So the bay that we know and the bay that we have been discussing this morning is, of course, we could describe it as an artificial bay. And I'm taking this from Scott Nixon's work on the Nile and Otto Moskowski's work, but it's really the same basic concept. Because of the amount of nitrogen that we began putting into Narragansett Bay down here, right, the level of productivity, the color of that water, that's almost an artificial result, right, because it's coming from our fertilization. And so now we have made the sort of decision to try to turn back that time. Why did we make that decision? Well, for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons was the Providence River estuary and some of the more shallow embayments were experiencing hypoxia and anoxia. I've just grabbed these two different maps from the Insomniac's website just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. I think it bears in mind that hypoxia and anoxia can be normal occurrences in an estuary. When you have lots of productivity, especially in the summertime and warmer months, you have a higher rate of metabolism because the waters, so you're going to be drawing down oxygen more. Because you have warmer water, you're going to have the less gas actually in that water, so there's going to be a lower availability of oxygen. Additionally, you can have stratification of the water column, and all of these things can lead to low oxygen. On top of that, if you add lots of nitrogen and you fertilize the system, then you produce more organic matter, so more food to eat, right? More oxygen then will get drawn down. And so these are sort of good examples in the Providence River estuary and some of the upper bay areas where this low oxygen then can lead to some deleterious impacts. Additionally, of course, there was the fish kill in 2003 that really acted as a dramatic and very public event that got people sort of garnered together and said, you know what, it's time for us to make a change. There was only one other recorded history of a fish kill in Narragansett Bay, and that was in 1898. And it was happening up here in the Providence River estuary and in Greenwich Bay. The 2003 fish kill that sort of garnered support and made these nitrogen mitigation sort of call into action was here in Greenwich Bay. I think it's important, and I won't go into those details, but it's not simply that there was just excess nitrogen here in production and productivity, but rather there was also an unusual circumstances of physical conditions that helped make this happen. So one of the things that I'm sure we're going to hear about more today is that even though we can dial back the nitrogen, we can still have low oxygen events because of the physics of the systems, as well as any sort of legacy impacts that Narragansett Bay is holding on to. Of course, we have this local impact of nitrogen inputs and then reduction that we've been doing, but we cannot ignore this climate change signal.
And I certainly understand this idea that climate change can't be blamed for everything, and I agree with that. I don't think that there is a black and white answer for any of this. It is complex and confusing, which is also, that's also interesting for us. So the total air temperature has gone up somewhere between 1.3 and 1.7 degrees Celsius since this time period. And if we look at surface water temperature, these are 3 different records. The gray is a NOAA buoy, the green is the long-term phytoplankton data set, temperature from the long-term phytoplankton data set we have, and the blue is from the long-term fish trawl. And you can see that the surface water increase has been a total of about 1.5 to 1.6 degrees Celsius over this time period. How this impacts our ecosystem is not straightforward. It's not simply you just dial up that temperature and then we know what's going to happen. Additionally, on top of that, we have other changes. For example, there's been an increase in precipitation since the 1960s. There's other things too, right? If you look at Pilson's work on the amount of wind that's been hitting Narragansett Bay, the wind has been decreasing. This is actually a New England-wide phenomenon. Wind really matters because if you want to get oxygen into your water column, you want to mix that water column, and a great way to do that is to blow wind on it, right? If you want to mix nutrients from the bottom into the surface waters to help grow phytoplankton, great way to do that is with wind. So if we're decreasing that, so now think about it, we're warming the waters, we've got more precipitation coming in, we've got less wind available, that all will change the ecosystem. One of the things that I want to sort of briefly touch on here before I finish is that this, I think that we had a decrease in the primary productivity in mid and lower Narragansett Bay long before we changed the nitrogen coming into this bay. So these are data from the long-term phytoplankton data set that was started by Ted Smeda. Dave Borkman's done a lot of work on this, and now Tatiana Anderson and the Graduate School of Oceanography is maintaining this. And we can see these are just annual means of chlorophyll over time. You can see there's some natural variability. Okay, no problem, that makes sense. It's a natural data set. But you can see since the 1970s, there was a really strong decline. The nutrient reduction began in 2005, and then I believe was fully implemented by 2012, and that's highlighted here in this yellow box. And so you can see that the decline started well before that. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is how do we manage a bay that is so complex and diverse. In the upper Providence River estuary, there is no doubt that is heavily nitrogen influenced and a lot of productivity with resulting negative consequences like low oxygen conditions. Additionally, though, in the mid and lower parts of the bay, they are almost being fed by that Providence River estuary. And we see, in this example, that primary productivity may have been decreasing long before the nutrient mitigation. Let me briefly describe why I think that's happening. I think this may be happening because of a combination of climate effects. So, for example, and again, these ideas are coming from a long line of work from Ted Smeda, Dave Berkman, Candace Oviatt, and Scott Nixon and others. But the idea here is simple, or sort of, let's see. So first, we know that phytoplankton production and phytoplankton are extremely light limited. And we also have seen that warmer winters have more cloudy days, and colder winters have more sunny days. So if we're going to amp up the temperature and have more cloudy days, and your phytoplankton are waiting in there for that light to turn on, and that light turns on later and later, then you have less opportunity for them to bloom. Additionally, we talked about the wind decreasing. If you have less wind mixing the water column, then you have less opportunity for phytoplankton to grab those nutrients. They may either get stuck on the top of the water, or and increase stratification. Other things that happen with temperature, we could have more zooplankton. Their metabolic rate could be increasing, and they could be chewing that phytoplankton down more quickly, so that there's less time for that phytoplankton to maintain or get itself into a bloom status. So I think as we move forward, we have to think about this complex geographic system we have and how the Providence River estuary may be quite different from the mid and lower bay. I want to close here by saying Scott called it a grand experiment or a grand adventure. I think we could also look at it as a challenge and an opportunity. Narragansett Bay, and I'll talk more about this later, is a really unique ecosystem. We have a fantastic opportunity here to study this change, to do so together, and I think to be really on the forefront of having stakeholders across the board and scientists come together and figure out how to manage this bay in the best possible way. So I want to end with this. That really, our grand challenge and opportunity is to try to quantify the impacts of a changing climate and decrease nutrient loading. And I think there's some interesting opportunities ahead, which I will talk to you about this afternoon. Thank you.
I think I'll just sit here. Yes.
So, thank you, Wally. Candace, please give us being our rapporteur, please give us your perspective on what you heard here. You could summarize that.
Both of these speakers have given us the grand history of Narragansett Bay, and I don't fault anything in those histories. It's been good and detailed. I particularly liked Tom Olvo's going back into the 1800s and showing you how very dramatic changes were happening even back then, with the loss of fisheries like salmon and the loss of scallops from Greenwich Bay. The last point that Wally was making here about the loss of chlorophyll in the bay, that's a very complex issue. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure that out myself. And what she has told you is absolutely correct. I don't want to deny anything that she's told you, that there's several limiting factors that can impact, particularly the winter-spring bloom. And I will be talking about that a little bit more in, I guess, the next, a couple of sessions from now. The warmer winters, she said the bay had warmed by a little over a degree, 1.7 degrees or something. That's on an annual basis. In the summertime, the fishermen's panel were correct. It's a little bit higher in the wintertime. It's over 2 degrees and up to 3 degrees in recent years. So warmer winters mean that the grazing community stays active in the wintertime water column. So a bloom will try to get started in the coldest part of the winter, but if it's not that cold, there'll be a lot of grazers in the water column, a lot of zooplankton, and they'll graze that bloom down, and that organic matter will never build up to a biomass that shows of an increase in chlorophyll. So from the 1970s up to the 2000s, we had lots of warm winters. And in those warm winters, we had very diminished winter-spring blooms. And we had a lot of zooplankton activity in the water column. So the organic matter that was produced was utilized in the water column, and it didn't go to the benthos. And I'll make this point a little bit later in my presentation. But that meant a very much diminished benthic community. And it also meant that over time, it had the appearance of a decreased chlorophyll concentration in the water column. And we've continued to experience warm winters, but occasionally we've gotten a cold winter here along the way. 2008 comes to mind. And when we've gotten a cold winter and we've still had plenty of nutrients in the bay, we've had, again, a winter-spring bloom with that organic matter going to the benthos. So it's been kind of up and down, a roller coaster here with respect to the wintertime chlorophyll in recent years. But the overall trend is we're going to have a warmer bay, and there is not going to be a winter-spring bloom, whether we have nutrients in the bay or not. So I just want to make that one clarification.
Thank you, Candace, and thank you. So I am going to open this up for 10 minutes to questions. We are not going to answer all of the bigger questions. We could ask some clarifications. We can have a discussion here. And I will also say that at the end, I would love for you guys to just state, if you would like, what might be your research question or hypothesis that we might look to the future. So, questions, clarifications, comments, here we go.
Just a thank you. Hi, my name's Laura. Just a clarification question for Wally. Did you say the same amount of nitrogen has been entering Narragansett Bay since the 1960s?
Yep, so there will be people in this audience that may disagree with me, but up until we've done this major nutrient mitigation, so in the mid-2000s, the amount of nitrogen coming into the bay really evened off from around the 1950s, 1960s until that time period. It wobbles, right? But in general, from our records, it looks like it was basically even. And I think that really bears fruit because it matters, because if you look at other estuaries, instead of doing this, they do this. So.
Thank you. Okay, up there, Jeremy. Yes, Sally will run on up. I will take this moment while Jeremy's getting that to remind us that the PowerPoints will be online. So not today, not tomorrow, but in the coming weeks, and we will certainly let you know.
Two things that the speaker said today. Tom mentioned in his introduction the historically productive fisheries that existed in Narragansett Bay and the Narragansett Bay watershed previous to industrialization. And Wally suggested in her talk that the high nutrient levels that we've seen has really been kind of a result of our own enrichment in the latter part of the 20th century. And so it always begs the question about what was the productivity base of these productive fish species and fisheries prior to industrialization. I'm not sure whether you can answer that on the spot, but this is a question that repeatedly comes up here in Narragansett Bay and other areas of New England.
Wally, Tom?
I have an idea for that, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, too. I think that, well, I'll just give away my punchline for later, but I think that basically, if you look at the prehistoric nutrient inputs, as Scott described those in his paper in 1997, he described Narragansett Bay as basically being a biological desert when we look at the inputs from land. But if you also incorporate the inputs from offshore, which I will talk about more later, and there's Chris Kincaid and Kevin Rose are working on this, and Dave Ullman, we begin to see that there may be a pretty significant source of nitrogen and other nutrients coming in from offshore waters. And I think that matters. And I think we also likely had a very different system with a clear water column, with salt marsh beds, seagrass beds, and a lot more internal nutrient cycling, and potentially more nitrogen fixation, of course I'm going to say that, in the sediments as well. And I think that those combinations, we had such a very different ecosystem that it was productive and internal recycling plus this offshore nutrient source. So very different than the one we've had over the last 150 years or so.
Thank you. Here we go.
Al Eagles. Okay. Candace, I have a question for Candace. Can there be a correlation made between the amount of nitrogen reduction in the bay to the amount of phytoplankton? I mean, the phytoplankton needs the nitrogen to survive. Has there ever been a correlation made in the effect on the phytoplankton as you're reducing the nitrogen?
Yes, I'm going to be addressing that in my presentation later this morning on primary production and how it has changed over time.
Thank you very much.
Great, so that gives you incentive to come on back. We have one right here.
Yeah, Mike McGivney. I was there for the fish kill. We were dedicating our upweller. I think Dr. Dale Levitt's up in the audience there for Roger Williams University. And it was in July, mid-July, and the water was pea green. And I remember making a joke about how that's supposed to be good for the environment. But I just want to emphasize that it really was a series of events that caused that particular fish kill. It was a really heavy rainfall just prior. If you know the topography of the area and how rich it is in that area, Coesit, that I think a lot of nitrogen came down. And then we had the neap tides that caused little water change. So sometimes these events happen and you should try to remedy them, but sometimes they are just events because everything lines up. And I think particularly the East Greenwich one, just remembering the weather then and how it, no wind in the water, it was really calm for like 5 or 6 days, that a lot of times these events just are like rolling, double aces or whatever, or, that's what happens. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Mike. I think we have one over here, and then we have time probably for one more question after that.
Good morning. From DEM. First of all, this is excellent, and I so appreciate both the panels so far today. So my question really follows Dr. Colley's, because I keep thinking, we can't go back in time. What's our baseline? We're not looking to bring the Bay back to pre-industrial times when we had the salt marshes and these different, I know when I worked in conservation, it's always this question of what are you trying to get to? So I think for me, the research question is both, or questions, kind of what's the baseline we're comparing against? And given the complexity of everything going on right now, what are we trying to get to? Because I'll just leave it at that, because I feel like part of the observations that we're taking over a 3 or a 5 year period are against a recent baseline, and now you've just given us some perspective on a broader baseline, and I think that's a really hard question.
So, well noted, Janet, in terms of that's a good research question for us to be looking at to the future. Any comments on that?
Well, I don't think it's up to the researchers to tell you what the bay should be like. I think it's the people that live here that should tell us what the bay should be like. And we can try and figure out whether it's going in that direction or some other direction, but we're not here to tell you what the bay should be.
Thank you. Really good point, and that's why we have a cross-section of stakeholders here, and the process on that will continue. One last question, right over here. Or comment.
Yeah, my first comment, it's more of a comment than a question. I'd just like to let Tom know that early in your slide presentation, you referenced 10 million pounds of landings for flounder down to 2 million pounds, and I'd just like to state, well, Narragansett Bay has been closed to flounder fishing for over 10 years with no help or increase in production. So just so you know, those numbers came from flounders that have been landing outside. They're not coming out of Narragansett Bay. The second thing, I just wanted to weigh in on what Mike had just said with it seems to me like we had a knee-jerk reaction to what happened in Greenwich Bay when that Menhaden kill took place. It was a unique thing of circumstances that took place which caused those fish to die. Could happen again even with nitrogen reduction. The neat tides and everything that took place. So that's another comment. And the last one I would like to say, kind of going back to what Director Coit was just talking about, is, and of course I'm going to say this because I'm a fisherman, how about maximum sustainable yield? That's what the Magnuson Act states, what we should be doing with fisheries. Narragansett Bay is a food source for Rhode Islanders, and we're always talking about food security. Maybe that's part of what we'll at least be looking at, that part of the equation, what we should be trying to get out of it. A healthy food source for Rhode Islanders. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that that's one of the other reasons why we need to really all come together, is to really clarify what our goals are for the future and to identify a path. The larger initiative to identify that path towards that future. So I'll just lastly ask, I see one question right here, Wally. How can we qualify the impacts of changing climate and decreased nutrient loading? Would that be one of the questions that you would put out to the...
Yeah, so I think for me that's the sort of overarching question, and then underneath that there's a whole range of other questions that have been already brought up, I think, by our panelists this morning, about how we fit this into a working bay, because it has been a working bay for our collective memory. And I think when we try to figure out a baseline, that's where we need help to figure out what do we want.
Tom? I know you had many.
I'm kind of going back to what Janet had to say, and we really have to decide what we want to get out of the bay, and what are the goals? What do we want to see restored? We're facing a lot of problems in the bay with sea level rise, climate change, depleted fisheries, and the bay is dramatically changing. And how do we figure out where's the end point? Where are we going?
Thank you. And Candace, you'll get another opportunity when you speak, but but do you have something just to add right now?
No, I'm good.
Well, let's thank our panelists. before the break, I'd just ask Jen to come up and make an announcement.
So we are going to have about a 10-minute break. And there are restrooms in the Coastal Institute if these are filled. But before we break, could Dean Corliss, Lanny Dellinger, Angelo Liberti, Matt Griffin, Mike Laptu, Allie Johnson, Corinne Truesdale, Anna Roebuck, Sally Michaud, and Joe Langdon come see me? You're in trouble. Thank you very much.
And this is a 10-minute break,
Right,
please.
so what time?
So please come back around 10:30.
10:30.
Kindly taking your seats, quieting down. My name is Alan DeBenet. I am the Assistant Director here at the Sea Grant Program, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce this next panel, which is going to be taking another step down from, step down maybe isn't the correct word, into a little more detail, a step up into a lot more complexity and detail. We've heard a really good initial sort of look from the first panel. We've been out on the water for all of our lives, and as Fred Matera was putting it, hundreds of years, and it certainly was that way, probably combined. But taking a look at, this is what we have been seeing out on the bay over many, many years, and then from the last panel, just sort of getting a really nice throw of the carpet out onto the floor to sort of set the table and looking at, this is what's been going on over the past several hundred years with regard to Narragansett Bay. This next panel has sort of a ominous name because it's got that word chemical in it. And chemistry, for much of us, is a fascinating, complex, and scary thing. I don't think we're going to be going into chemical equations and how things bond and don't bond and all that kind of fun stuff, as intriguing as it is, but be taking a slightly bigger overview from our three panelists, taking a look at how that chemistry in the bay has been changing over the past 100 or so years, and again, setting up sort of the next scenario when we start to then jump into the biology and ecology. Our three speakers this morning are Angelo Liberti from the DEM Water Resources. He's the Chief of Surface Water Protection. He has a long history with the department and has been very, very involved in the wastewater treatment programs and sort of the nutrient reduction end of things. Art Spivak is a professor of oceanography here at GSO. He has expertise in biogeochemistry. That's really looking at how chemistry and biology play together nicely and sometimes not. We have Rick McKinney from the EPA Atlantic Ecology Division, who is an ecosystem ecologist working with habitat assessment and utilization in wetlands. And then as rapporteur, we have Rick Hiddinger, who is an environmental scientist and a principal at Alliance Environmental Group. He's also first vice president with the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. So not only is he a scientist and well aware of things from a technical nature, but is also a very heavy user, at least on the fish end of things. At this point, I'm going to call Angelo up. He is going to be our first speaker. We're going to hold questions as we have in the end, other sessions till the end. This section is called Changes in the Bay Chemical Inputs. Angelo is going to kick things off, taking a look at chemical inputs from wastewater treatment plants.
Hi. Sorry. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to everybody. I got a lot of material I'm going to try to cover in a quick, short period of time. We also have a poster for the session later on this afternoon that Heidi Travers is going to be manning to help answer some other questions that might come up if we don't have time. So I wanted to start by focusing on how we actually, All right. First, I want to point out there's 19 major wastewater treatment facilities, 17 that are within the bay, depending on your definition of the bay, westerly into the Pawcatuck River, and the New Shore Arm wastewater treatment plant. At this time, there's really hardly any industrial wastewater discharges directly into the bay. Most of them go into the wastewater treatment plants. There are really only 2 left in the state. So I'm going to focus on the municipal wastewater treatment plants. Oops. Yeah, I'm doing well here. All right. Each wastewater facility does a facility plan where they plan for the future growth of their community, how much wastewater they anticipate they will need to process, collect and process. And we call that their design flow. This is just a pie chart of relative amount of flow for the state. And since Tom had to take a dig at me earlier, you can see the Narragansett Bay Commission is about half of the flow, wastewater flow in the state. When the Clean Water Act started, there are 3 main types of permit limits. Technology-based limits, which have to be met everywhere in the country, regardless of the circumstances of the receiving water body. And when it comes to municipal treatment plants, we refer to those as secondary treatment. There are limits for things like biochemical oxygen demand, suspended solids, and pH. The next step really was to start looking, is that enough to protect the water body for the assigned uses, things like swimming, shellfishing, aquatic habitat. And if it's not, we're required to impose limits on any pollutants that a discharge has a reasonable potential to impact the water body. The third step is called a whole effluent toxicity test or bioassay test. Organisms are basically immersed in the effluent to see whether it causes toxicity. So in this way, if there are particular pollutants present that we're not monitoring for, this is sort of a catch-all test to see if there are any lethal effects or reproductive effects. So it can help account for chemicals interacting with one another that are more toxic than they would be individually, or things that we're not monitoring for. And actually, the approved procedures for those tests were developed across the street at the EPA lab in Narragansett, and we continue to use those species as well as the test methods. I wanted to talk first about the water quality-based limits for toxic pollutants. So these are pollutants that would have a direct toxic effect on aquatic life. And we've adopted the EPA standards. Some of them are also based on humans consuming organisms, shellfish or fish. But it's a translator from a water column concentration that would end up in the food chain that would be harmful to humans. So between those 2 types of limits for saltwater, we've adopted over 100 different standards. For toxic pollutants, we ensure that the concentration is met, the protective concentration or standard is met in a short distance from the outfall. 2 ways that we do that. One is from a mixing zone model that basically looks at how it initially mixes close to the outfall. We also required that some of the treatment plants introduce dye into their effluent for a few days and then go out in the receiving water and monitor where dilution occurs at various distance away from the outfall. So we have these relatively small mixing zones where at the edge of that zone you have to be in compliance with this water quality criteria. So Fields Point is probably the largest. It's about a mile long in the Providence River and 500 feet wide. But like Quonset Point has a 90-foot radius where the short-term water quality criteria, the acute, has to be met, and a larger area with a chronic. So those would apply to things like ammonia, chlorine, and metals. And I know there's been a lot of concern about wastewater disinfection, so I wanted to make sure that I covered that today. Beginning in the early 90s, we started applying the water quality based, or the criteria that is protective of aquatic life, developing permit limits based on that. And the EPA standards are based on the most stringent species for which toxicity data was available, and that includes silversides, copepods, and oysters. There's been a dramatic reduction in the amount of chlorine that's been discharged from wastewater treatment plants. And it's an 85% reduction between 97 and 2001. And since then, it's been pretty steady at 96 to 98%. In 2016, only 20 pounds from every treatment plant in the bay, 20 pounds of chlorine was discharged into the bay. And frankly, some of that was actually discharged into the Pawcatuck and some of it into Rhode Island Sound. But I was recently asked to convert that into something more meaningful, and I hadn't really thought of it this way before, but I was quite shocked when I did. That basically 20 pounds is equal to 80 gallons of household bleach, the same amount of chlorine in the entire bay. And if you turn that into something else, it's 7 drops of household bleach in an Olympic swimming pool. And that, more shocking to me, is that the permit limit that we set for the Fields Point treatment plant is 800,000 times less strong than household bleach. So that's how protective we're being to aquatic life, is that the number that aquatic life can tolerate is much, much lower than even household bleach. So how do people achieve this? Well, when we set a permit limit, and I know people seem to hear, I sit in my office and I just unilaterally dictate, you do this, you do that, and people jump. It's quite powerful and amazing position to be in. But my name gets thrown around a lot because I've been here a long time and I sign a lot of these permits and consent agreements, but these decisions aren't made in a vacuum, trust me. But anyway, sorry. So one of the things most plants did is they, in their facility plan, decide how are they going to achieve compliance with the permit limits. They look at different options, costs of those options, short and long-term costs, and they select an option. And as long as there's no environmental detriment to what they select, we approve that it gets designed to build. So most went to dechlorination, and Dr. Spivak's going to talk a little more about chlorination, dechlorination. But most added another chemical to neutralize the chlorine. And that results in the formation of sulfate, and there's been some concerns about that, but the natural level of sulfate in the receiving water is about 1,000 times higher than it is in the discharge. And toxicity tests that I talked about earlier, bioassays, we had done those in the past after chlorination, and they were highly toxic, which is what you expect. That's, sorry, that's what you want your chlorine to do, kill things. Kill bacteria, kill viruses. It also kills phytoplankton, zooplankton. But after dechlorination, there was virtually no toxicity detected in the effluent testing we've been doing. There were 3 treatment plants that chose to go to UV light for disinfection. Tom mentioned earlier that there's been a drastic reduction in metals, and that occurred quite some time ago. I won't spend any more time on that. One of the things I guess I want to make sure about nutrients is the department did not regulate nutrients because of the fish kill. I want to make sure everybody understands that. Since the early 80s, it had been documented by URI, the Narragansett Bay Project, that there were significant portions of the upper bay suffering the effects of excessive nitrogen, excessive algae growth, and low dissolved oxygen. There were other fish kills. There weren't massive fish kills, and there remains fish kills today. But it wasn't all about a fish kill. Yes, a big fish kill is a bunch of circumstances that come together. But really, we talked about oxygen too much, I think, and not enough about the ecosystem benefits of reducing primary productivity. That was the goal. That's not a surprise. That was the goal. Reduce primary productivity, allow more sunlight to penetrate, get seagrasses back, better habitat, and improve the diversity of aquatic life in the bay. The most impacted areas are Greenwich Bay, Providence, Seekonk, Narragansett Bay. Treatment plants in Rhode Island, there were 11, 6 in Massachusetts to the upper bay that have been addressed, just because I'm running out of time here. I wanted to point out that to set a target for the nitrogen reduction, we relied mostly on the Marine Ecosystem Research Lab, or the Merle tank experiments that Dr. Oviatt and others conducted here at GSO. They dosed the tanks and they measured some ecological responses. We looked at those responses along with data on the cost of implementation and came up with an adaptive management approach to implement this 50% reduction, which was set into state law. EPA took a separate effort to reduce nitrogen in the Taunton River and Mount Hope Bay. So quickly up top shows the timeline of the reductions in Rhode Island. The bottom graph shows what's happened with Massachusetts and Rhode Island combined. What am I doing? You can wrap it up. All right. So the treatment plants impacting the upper bay, which is where we focused as the most severely impacted part of the bay, have reduced about 65%. Using the Bay Project's latest report on the state of Narragansett Bay, that equated to about a 50% reduction of nitrogen loads to the entire bay. Treatment plants are still a large portion, about half of the remaining load to the treatment plants. I'll skip over. There's also been a significant reduction in phosphorus from wastewater treatment plants in Mass and Rhode Island, which is reflected in the bay-wide loadings. And I can wrap it up, but 3 documents. We haven't been great at getting out some of our success stories, so we've come up with 3 documents. One is just history from the beginning of time of each wastewater treatment plant and their major upgrades. We've got a document with more details on chlorine specifically, and another one on most of the topics I talked about today.
Thank you. Okay, next up at bat, Art Spivak, and he is going to be talking about how do chlorine inputs from wastewater treatment affect Narragansett Bay. This way.
Okay, how do I start it? Which one is the forward? My short.
Well, first I want to say I'm really honored and happy to be here to talk to an audience who seems so interested. I teach in, this is a room I teach in often, and usually by the end of this is the last week of semester, most of the people are asleep. We'll see what happens here. Alan said there's no equation. Well, actually, he didn't look at my presentation. He doesn't know me very well. Okay. So I'm really...
The other folks can't hear you without the mic. Oh, okay. Maybe that's why people are usually asleep. Okay. So I'm going to give a brief sort of just chemical background about chlorination, dechlorination, and how it may directly affect the bay. So, as you know, chlorination is, the goal is simply to kill pathogens, okay? And there's 2 ways that chlorine can be added. You can either add chlorine gas, or you can add a salt of hypochlorite. When chlorine gas is added, here, it simply reacts with water and makes something we call hypochlorous acid. I restate that up there. The other way to make hypochlorous acid is to add salts of hypochlorite. They just pump solution in to the wastewater at the end of treatment. You okay, Dennis? Yeah. Okay. And I thought he might be asleep already. No. Okay. And you make hypochlorous acid. Okay. Well, it's an acid, so it can dissociate. This is what we mean. Something is an acid, it makes H+. So a solution of hypochlorous acid will have hypochlorous acid and hypochlorite in it. Okay? And those 2 species together are what we call the free reactive chlorine. And we'll see, we'll talk about the values that those have in the effluent. And the relative amount of hypochlorous versus hypochlorite. This depends on the pH. Most wastewaters are in this region, so there's a variable amount of those 2 things. Okay, but the hypochlorous acid is actually the one that's more effective at killing stuff. Okay. Now, one of the other things besides killing
pathogens, the hypochlorous acid can react with ammonia, which can be in the wastewater, and create what we call, well, these compounds here, monochloramine and dichloramine, and even trichloramine. One of the interesting things in drinking supply waters, when you add a whole lot of free chlorine, it actually breaks down these compounds and turns the ammonia into nitrogen. But that doesn't happen in the wastewater treatment process. Okay. So I bring that up because I think some people have come forward and said, well, we think there's too much chlorine being added and we could smell it in the water. Well, actually, when you smell that pool smell, it's not really the chlorine you're smelling usually. The noxious pool smell is actually the chloramines, okay? What that really means is you've got people who are putting ammonia into your pool, right? I don't have to tell you how that necessarily happens. Okay. But, so what I'm getting at is, it's these compounds here that create that smell, and it's not from too much chlorine. All right. Now, it's well known we're putting chlorine in to kill things, so you don't want to discharge chlorine into the environment because it will have a negative effect. So what's done these days is to reduce the amount of free reactive chlorine and the combined reactive chlorine, which includes those chloramines. You add a salt of sulfite, and simply the sulfite reacts with the acid, the free reactive acid, and it turns it into chloride and sulfate. That happens very quickly, almost on the time scales of mixing. Okay, oops. Okay, so we end up with a product that's coming out, ideally coming out of the wastewater treatment plants, that's reduced in this and has converted the sulfite to sulfate and the chlorine to chloride. Well, to do that, you have to add excess sulfite. And so you say, well, what about that sulfite? Is that something that's a bad thing to discharge from the plants? Well, excess sulfite actually will be converted to sulfate by a reaction with oxygen in the wastewater. So you react it, let it sit for a while. The sulfite, the excess sulfite, which wasn't used for reducing the amount of reactive chlorine, is then converted to sulfate. So the two products you get are sulfate and chloride, which in seawater are major components of seawater. Okay? And we can compare the amount of sulfate and chloride we're adding to this from the discharge to what's there, and at the saltiness of the bay, the relative amount of sulfate and chloride we're adding are at the level that's immeasurable compared to what the background is. Okay? So we're adding something to the bay that wouldn't be there, chemicals, but the chemicals that we're adding already exist there, and we're just making a tiny, tiny change in the amount. Okay, so I want to just remind you what we call the total chlorine residual. That's the free chlorine, that's the hypochlorous, and the combined, those are the chloroamines, are the total chlorine residual. And that's what's monitored in the effluent. And here's a graph I got from Angelo of the history of annual total residual chlorine load. And you can see, well, big step change between 97 and 2001, and continued decrease to, what did you say, that's about a 98% decrease? Yeah. And it's been stable and even decreasing substantially. So it was almost a step change at the beginning of the century, and a continued decrease. So that's kind of where I want to wrap up.
All I can say is that put a whole new perspective on jumping in the pool at the Y. Yeah, we're going to hold questions till right at the end. Our third and final panelist is Rick McKinney. He is going to be talking about how much of the nutrients are coming from the wastewater treatment plants.
All right, thanks, Alan. So I'm presenting the work of Autumn Oskowski, who unfortunately can't be here today. And as Alan mentioned, I've been working in the Bay for many, many years, but I'm more of a wetlands person, not so much an estuarine ecologist, but I have helped with this project with Autumn, and I'll do the best I can to try to get her the message across. And Autumn's work, one aspect of Autumn's work is really looking at how nutrients, nitrogen in particular, nitrogen from human sources is incorporated into estuarine ecosystems. And we thought that probably relevant to this discussion today, an aspect of her work is really taking a look at how specifically nitrogen is incorporated into food webs in Narragansett Bay, and kind of comparing pre and post upgrade, post sewage treatment plant upgrade that were is the subject of discussion today. And I also want to just mention that I think Autumn really took to heart Scott Nixon's call for more research on this topic of once this nitrogen reduction took place in the Bay, and this is really her approach to that that call for more research here. So we used the technique to try to get a handle on this question of how much of the sewage nitrogen is getting into Bay food webs. We used the analytical technique that is called stable isotope analysis. And it's a tool that we can use to try to get an idea, a signature of different types of sources of nutrients into food webs. And I'll start out by talking about nitrogen stable isotope analysis. It's a bit of a complex technique, but for the purposes of this discussion, really it's based on using subtle changes in atoms that take place when the atoms undergo transformations. So in the case of nitrogen stable isotope analysis, we're looking at these subtle changes as nitrogen undergoes transformation in the Bay. For example, from being introduced as a dissolved nutrient and being introduced into food webs. And we can actually use stable isotope analysis to trace that nitrogen up food webs. And it's nitrogen isotope analysis has a lot of utility in food web analysis. And we have instrumentation that we can use, that we can actually sample components of a food web, for example, and we get a sense of the instrumentation isotope mass spectrometer just gives us a number that can be related to the transformation that the nitrogen has gone through. And the take-home message, or the important point for this particular problem, is that in addition to being useful in studying food webs, nitrogen that undergoes different transformations can have a stable isotope signature that can be indicative of its source. So, for example, nitrogen from wastewater treatment facilities undergoes a series of transformations that gives it a particularly high stable isotope value. And the values that we get for nitrogen are usually numbers between 0 and 20. So this, and as opposed to, say, natural nitrogen that enters an ecosystem, for example, from oceanic nitrogen, that would have a lower stable isotope value. So we can use this as actually a tracer of the nutrient into the food web. And that's basically the premise behind this particular project that I'm talking about, or the study that I'm talking about now. And also we can use carbon isotopes. Carbon are not quite as informative in our case, but carbon is generally used to identify an overall food source. For example, if an organism or an animal is eating a corn-based diet, it will have a higher carbon isotope ratio. If a marine-based diet will have an intermediate isotope ratio value. A woody plant-based diet will have a lower carbon isotope value. And this carbon isotope is usually preserved throughout a food web, so it doesn't change much. However, the work that Autumn has done has shown that carbon isotope in estuarine ecosystems can also be an indicator of productivity in the ecosystem, and we can use that in the study as well to kind of get a handle on what's going on possibly in the bay. So we did some analysis of particulate matter in Narragansett Bay, and this was done we did, Autumn and I and others have been looking at particulate matter over the past 4 or 5 years or so, but other studies have looked at it earlier and even pre-upgrade. And so I just want to walk through this graph here with you. So this is a graph of some particulate matter values, for stable isotope values. And the reason we looked at particulate matter in the bay was that it's relatively easy to get, and it can be a surrogate for the base of the food chain. So it can kind of give us an idea of how nutrients are impacting a food web from the base. So what we have here on the y-axis is this isotope ratio value, again ranging in 0 to 20 or so. Along the x-axis is time. We have two data points, two series of data points from pre-treatment around 2000 to 2002 from earlier studies, and our data from 2014, 2016 post-treatment. So what are we looking at here? Well, the kind of, I guess, the gold or greenish dots are the older particulate matters pre-treatment, and this kind of is, we're looking at this as our situation before upgrade. The teal, what would we expect, the teal or post-treatment? So post-treatment, of course, we're dealing with less nitrogen in the system. That's pretty much assumed. And what we would think is that the blue line on this plot is the isotope ratio of nitrogen from Rhode Island Sound waters. And this is an older value, but it's the best we can get. And what we were thinking, our hypothesis was that post-treatment, post-upgrade, that these isotope ratio values would either stay the same or decrease more towards maybe the natural Rhode Island Sound input of nitrogen or other natural inputs of nitrogen that would have lower isotope values. The teal, the tan line up top here is the value of effluent out of the sewage treatment plant. What we actually are seeing in our teal points, our more recent points, post-upgrade points, is more of a trend towards the higher effluent values. And we see this as indicating that, well, definitely post-upgrade, nitrogen from sewage treatment plants is definitely getting into food webs in Narragansett Bay. And matter of fact, Autumn quantified this. It doesn't look totally definitive here, but if you take out seasonality, the winter values are less definitive. The other seasons show definitely about a value of 2 increase in nitrogen stable isotope ratio with the post-upgrade values, which is demonstrating that nitrogen is impacting and getting into the food webs here. And that was basically the question. Carbon values, as I mentioned, we looked at carbon values in quahogs, and they can be indicative of productivity. Take-home message here is that post-upgrade carbon values decreased rather in quahogs. In quahogs, any bivalve is a good sentinel organism because they integrate this signal over time. So post-upgrade, we saw a decrease in carbon values, which is consistent with decrease in overall productivity based on the work that Autumn has shown. So basically, our stable isotope results, they're not like, we're not quantitative in the sense that we can get an exact percentage of the nutrients that are getting into the food webs, but they definitely provide supporting evidence. And the take-home message that I went too far. It's not the first time it's happened to me. Okay, so the take-home message, that we have is that, first of all, the stable isotope values for nitrogen didn't necessarily respond the way we thought they would. We thought that they would decrease, showing more natural inputs of nitrogen. They trended towards increasing, and this allows us to conclude that the nitrogen stable isotope values allow us to conclude that the Bay food web still relies heavily on sewage N to supplement it. And there is definitely, our carbon stable isotope values show that support the idea that productivity is decreased in the Bay. And again, this research, it's supporting evidence. There are different interpretations of stable isotope data as well. And I know some, Wally had mentioned that maybe Rhode Island Sound nitrogen might be subsidizing the Bay to some extent too. There's definitely, this isn't cast in stone. There are other processes going on, recycling of nitrogen that will confound our data, but at least the preliminary data, it does seem that sewage nitrogen is definitely impacting the Bay. And that's it's still even post-upgrade, which could be an interesting point. And that's basically what we have. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to the three panelists. Before we open it up to questions from the audience, I want to boot it over to Rich Hittinger. And just, Rich, do you have anything you would like to either summarize, point out, pick apart a particular question, something that would help pull what we've heard from the three panelists together?
Well, it's very interesting because the three discussions were quite different. It's there was a comment earlier today, I think it was from Mike McGivney, that maybe we should look at timing some of the discharge of nitrogen into the bay, and I was curious how that fits in, with some of the things that Angela was saying. We set our standards based on the summer and the fact that we don't want to cause hypoxia events in the summer. However, the discharge of nitrogen may not be as harmful in the winter. And so, I think that that was an interesting concept that Mike first spoke about, but it might fit into some of the regulatory scheme as well. I don't know, Angela, if you wanted to.
Sure, sorry. I probably ran out of time to point it out, but right now the reductions are primarily in the summertime, May through October. Generally, from our discussions with people at GSO and others, that's really the period of time when nitrogen discharge to the bay plays an important role in hypoxia. And nitrogen discharge in the winter time doesn't hang around in the bay to cause a significant problem in the summer hypoxia. So for now, we've required that the treatment plants continue to operate their treatment process for nitrogen removal throughout the winter. It's less effective at the colder wastewater temperatures than it is during the summertime. And sorry, I'm not exactly sure the difference in percent removal between the summer and winter. The other thing I guess I should have pointed out is that the dissolved oxygen criteria that we develop now is based on larval survivability. And those experiments were also done at the EPA lab here in Narragansett. And so the point is that we're looking to reduce hypoxia to increase the larval survivability so that there is more aquatic life that's able to survive hypoxia and be available as a resource.
Great. Any other point, Rich, before I pop it out to the audience?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one other observation, and that is, it seems pretty clear that the chlorination and dechlorination itself is not causing a chlorine problem or a sulfate problem in the bay. I mean, it seems chemically very clear that the chlorine itself is gone by the time the discharges in the bay for a very short period of time. And the reaction products of chloride and sulfate are insignificant. So I think, whatever these observations are that people are making regarding a chlorine odor, it's not really chlorine.
Okay, one point I did want to bring up before we move on, it didn't have too much to relate to here. One of the professors here at URI, Chris Kincaid, came up during the break and just mentioned that it would be useful to point out, and I think he's right, that particularly with some of the earlier dialogues when we were talking about water temperatures and all of the information was being presented in degrees Celsius, when by and large most of us are used to thinking about degrees Fahrenheit. And the difference between those can be almost double. So that when they were talking about a temperature increase in Celsius of a couple of degrees, really thinking more towards maybe 5 or 6 degrees on that Fahrenheit scale that many of us are so familiar with. So it's just a useful thing to point out. And I would just urge folks as scientists are talking about some of their units, is maybe to ask if they could translate into sort of the more American units that we're more attuned to. So with that, I just want to open it up to questions from the audience up in the back.
Hello, my name is Jose De Silva from Bristol Wastewater. For Angelo, on our new permit for water quality testing, we've always had fecal coliform, but in addition, we've got enterococci now. How has the results correlated? And then in general, earlier slide said there was a 71% increase in precipitation. In the last few years, I've been hearing an awful lot about stormwater utilities coming on board. I don't know if anybody had to comment about that, where we are with that implementation.
So under the federal shellfish program, they use fecal coliform bacteria as an indicator, and we're not really free to change that if we want to participate. So that's the reason we use that. And then we adopted enterococci as a swimming standard or an exposure standard to recreation. So we require that the treatment plants continue to monitor both of those so that we can have a handle on both of those criteria. It is surprising how disparate those two tests can be. You would think that since they're both kind of monitoring for the same general concept, basically bacteria from warm-blooded animals, that they should track. They should go up together, they should go down. They may not be identical, but sometimes they're shockingly different. Overall, I would say they trend pretty good, but occasionally I get surprised by the differences.
Way up in the corner.
Just so you know, this is my daughter Sally, and I'm making her work today.
I have a two-part question. The first being the nitrogen, I believe it's 50% is coming out of the waste treatment plants, if I'm correct. That nitrogen, you're using two chemicals that are poisonous. Is this nitrogen poisonous? That's one part of the question. The other part is how come, if I'm not mistaken, you stated we are not going to talk about the several hundred byproducts, well, to 1,000 byproducts from chlorine and sodium bisulfate that are toxic to marine life. Did I hear correctly that you're not going to talk about that?
Any response?
I guess on ammonia can be toxic, but total nitrogen is not. And all the treatment plants are meeting nitrogen limits to protect for toxicity. To reduce nitrogen, they pretty much eliminate almost all the ammonia. As far as chlorinated byproducts, we do annual priority pollutant scans. We used to do them more frequently, but hardly anything showed up out of the 126 pollutants. And the things that do, we have limits now and regular monitoring for those things of concern. The issue of chlorinated byproducts, from my perspective, I would say we do this whole effluent toxicity test to look at the mixture of anything that's in the wastewater and whether it's toxic or not. And we've had excellent results on those samples with very little chronic or long-term effects to the species tested. But I don't know if Dr. Spivak can talk a little more about, what level and how many different chlorinated organic compounds there might be in wastewater, but that's kind of how we're approaching it right now.
One of the things that I would say is everything that I understand is we test for general toxicity by using aquatic organisms, like Angelo said. So if you don't know what the chemical might be, you can expose organisms, and if you then have no toxicity, then you assume that you've looked for all of the various compounds. In addition, looking for 150 or so compounds that are known to be toxic on a regular basis, we haven't found them. Now, so I think the idea is if somebody had a particular compound that they were worried about, that could be analyzed. But in this situation, we've done kind of the empirical approach of exposing animals and they don't die, and the specific approach of analyzing for 150 or so compounds that we know are toxic and not finding them. So we don't believe that these compounds are an issue.
No, he didn't say they don't exist. He said that they're already looking at a variety of things and not any, it might not be the specific chemical that you are interested in or had in mind, but they would assume that that would show up through their toxicity testing, and then they could look farther if there was something at issue. I have time for one final question. Let's try right down in the front. Okay, we have one more.
Okay, thank you very much. Angelo, I have a question about the toxicity test. I've done some research on it, and I know that you use mysids and the sex urchins of sea urchins. And I've read how they've done the test, and the mysids are grown in the lab. They've never seen the ocean. Their grandparents have never seen the ocean. And they test them. You have the acute test is one of them you do. And my question is, why aren't you using some kind of an indicated species that are local and native to Narragansett Bay? And I understand these are easy to accumulate, to get to research, these mysids and the sex organs. And these tests are only done quarterly, I believe, and sometimes they're not even done then, depends on the conditions. And the other thing too is some of these tests, as far as Narragansett Bay Commission goes, some of the tests are done on Buckland Point, but only observations are made on Fields Point. So there's a lot of gray area on the toxicity test, and I don't think they're really relative to Narragansett Bay. And every estuary is different in how it, what's available for life forms. And so I think your toxicity test has to be generated to reflect Narragansett Bay and not the recommendations that are throughout the country. Okay, can you answer that?
Yeah, I would say they are representative of Narragansett Bay, and plenty of biologists here can correct me, but both Atlantic purple sea urchins are found in rocky portions of the bay. Mysid shrimp that are used are found. The reason you don't go out in the wild and collect them is because you don't want something that has a problem that is stressed, and it might die because it's stressed and it's not due to the toxicity in the effluent. So they're carefully raised in the lab, and there's some quality control so that they're basically a fair test, I would say. They're all of the same health, and you run controls so you can tell whether or not what you observe is really due to the effluent and not due to some other natural problem. Also, EPA looks at making sure that they cover the most sensitive species, and they don't just assign test methods for a hardy organism or a ridiculously sensitive organism. So they always pick like 4 or so of the most sensitive species to base the test on. And as far as toxicity testing, I'm pretty sure the Narragansett Bay Commission does not do any bioassay testing at their lab at Fields Point. Most of that gets sent out to a specialized lab that has EPA certification to do this kind of testing. Most of their chemical testing, they do at a central facility at Fields Point, and they bring their samples from Buckland Point.
Okay, I thought we have one more question. I thought I saw a hand over here. Way up in the back again. If she's tired tonight, Jen, you'll know why.
My question is this: if all the sewage treatment plants in Rhode Island were required to use UV, what would be the net effect on the bays, waters?
I personally don't think there would be any effect on the bay waters.
Okay, I guess we are going to call this session to a close. I'd like to thank all the panelists.
How's the married life treating you?
But he did a pointer too. I guess the pointer's on the.
Yeah, there was a.
All right, folks, we're ready to start the next session. So this session is on changes in Narragansett Bay for habitats and critters. And this is going to add on to what we've heard so far today. You know, we had a great stakeholder perspective. We heard some history. We've heard about choices we've made. We heard about the chemical inputs. Going now to hear about habitat and critters. First it's going to be habitat. Then we're going to have lunch, which is a good thing, and then we will move into the critters after that. The format that we're going to use is the speaker will give their presentation, and then the rapporteur will ask one clarifying question, then the next speaker will go, the rapporteur will ask one clarifying question, and then we'll open the questions up to the audience. So,
The speakers for this are Steve Granger, he's going to talk about eelgrass, and Candace Oviatt, who's going to talk about primary production. Both of them are researchers here at GSO with many years of experience. It's a pleasure to have worked with them over many years. And Caitlin Chafee is our rapporteur. She works at Coastal Resources Management Council with me, and I don't think I introduced myself when I stood up. I'm Dave Butel from Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council. Anyway, I know most of you. So we are ready to start. We will start with Steve Granger.
Thanks, Dave. Well, it's a familiar territory. I look around, I see a lot of people that have gone through these doors, but for those of you who haven't been here, as a student, we're required to give a seminar in this auditorium. We've made a fancier auditorium across the street, but still, this is the one in which we discuss science, so it's a perfect setting for this particular discussion today. I'm going to talk about seagrass. I'll see if I can figure this out, like that. This is the obligatory slide that everyone puts up that says, why do we like seagrass? Boaters hate it, and that runs into their props, but we love it because it provides a protective habitat for juvenile finfish and food for waterfowl. It slows water, increases the clarity, and acts like a little oasis in concentrating carbon. So it's a resource for food and habitat for a variety of different animals and some other plants too. Oops, that way. It is one of the first, I'm sorry, the slide got chopped up a little bit, but this is one of the first marine plants to be fully sequenced in its DNA. Geneticists tell us that the primordial beds are over here in the Baltic and in the Kattegat, that they moved over to the North American continent a long time ago, before the last glaciation, via the Arctic. So it's a cold-loving plant. It came from the cold, and cold is where it's looking to grow. During the last glaciation, the seagrass beds retreated to areas around here, below the Aleutians, and into an Arctic refuge. And after the glaciers retreated, the grass beds then repopulated the east and west coast. Temperature regulates their range. In North Carolina and in the Gulf of California here, mean summer temperatures are around 85, 86 degrees. So that is its southern habitat for this one particular species. And again, it's because of its background coming from the Arctic. It can grow in a variety of different sediments, from cobble all the way to fine sands. It doesn't like highly organic sediments. When organic contents get above 10 or 11 grams per in the ash-free dry weight, it begins to develop sulfides, and that's toxic to these particular plants. Just a little bit about its, we're going to talk about why it's decreasing in its habitat here, and maybe if we knew how it grew, it would help a little bit. The plant survival technique is that it wants to push forward. Its meristem pushes forward as it grows, and it mines into new sediments, so it gets a new fresh source of nutrients as it moves forward. It produces a new leaf from this sheath right here, the central bundled sheath, and that is its survival technique. There are 150 different types of plants and animals that want to grow on its leaves. So its solution to this is, I need to produce a new leaf every 4 to 5 days. And if you slow that growth rate down, the plant starts to lose that carbon balance, and it starts to die. It can reproduce in two ways. The first way is that it produces a lateral shoot, and this is just like a rhizome will produce a daughter plant that is genetically identical to the parent plant. So there's no variation in its genes at all. It also can reproduce sexually, where it produces seeds, and this gives the plant an opportunity to exchange genetic information with beds that are around it. Now the problem is, of course, is that as that long continuous ribbon along the east and west coast broke up as nutrient inputs increased and populations moved to the sea, the the geographic distance between beds, like we lost all of the grass in Delaware Bay, the geographic distance between the beds became so great that they can't exchange the pollen between beds, and therefore they become bottlenecked or genetically isolated in that particular area. And that's some of the problems that we're beginning to see here. Now, we've talked about this a lot. This one image is burned in my mind when it first came out. They took a package of sensors that were on a satellite circling the Earth. They put it on a U-2 spy plane, flew it over at 90,000 feet, and this is a composite picture of Narragansett Bay. Just focus on this first chlorophyll picture. Again, this is the Providence River, if you can focus a little bit, Greenwich Bay, and then down Bay here. The red represents the chlorophyll bloom produced from nutrients in the Providence River. You can see it's outwelling into the upper bay. This was done in 1997 and moving down Bay. So the bay is a continuum of water quality. The lowest water quality is at its head, because 57 or 60% of the nutrients that enter the bay enter in the Providence River, but it's only 7% of the total volume of the bay. So this little portion of the bay is receiving an enormous amount of nutrients, translating it into primary production and then pumping it down into the bay. And we've seen the effect through these previous talks about what reducing nitrogen inputs to the Providence River has done to the reduction in primary production. So again, worst water quality is up in the head of the waters, and the best water quality is down here for a number of reasons. One is that it's diluted and clearer because of the offshore water, and that most of the entering tide, the flooding tide, moves in through the East Passage, and we'll see the effect of that, bringing in cool water into the east side of Narragansett Bay. Again, you've seen this picture in an earlier talk, just showing that, and this is the Providence River, showing that there was eelgrass bed back in 1865 when they did this survey. So the head of the bay at that point wasn't affected. This is before we brought water into the homes and we started pumping our nutrients into to the head of the bay. So oyster beds and seagrass beds were prominent. And this is a sea ice map drawn in 1867. I just wanted to show you that things were a lot colder then. The blue is permanent ice that was formed and stayed in place for the winter. This is drifting ice down here and intermittent ice coverage down here. So back in 1867, things were mighty cold. Now what happened after, we know that before we put nutrients into the bay, we had grass throughout the bay. In 1997, I believe, Blaine Kopp interviewed a number of different fishermen through the bay. Each of these yellow markers are places where there was some evidence that seagrass existed, either through herbarium specimens from the Smithsonian, direct communication with fishermen. And so we can see that through the time period of 40 to 79, the bay was pretty well populated with seagrass. Fast forward to today. We've lost a lot of the seagrass all in the head of the bay, as we saw, and there are about twice as much seagrass in the East Passage as in the West Passage. That's a consequence of that cold water penetrating deeper into the bay and on the East Passage. You can see that the general trend in Narragansett Bay is downward, and this map, I suggest that we all take a look at the map and analysis done by Mike Bradley from CRMC. He sliced and diced this data nicely, and you can see each of the ponds individually. Just the oversight of it today is the fact that we're on a general downward trend in Narragansett Bay and in the coastal ponds. There are two, as we mentioned earlier, there are two noteworthy areas. East Greenwich has now shown a new bed that has developed, and as well as some in Narrow River. There's some good news in Charleston Pond. There is a fairly stable population there. In fact, 2 years or a number of years ago, we dredged about 2 acres from there, replanted it, and it all took. So conditions are pretty good in Charleston Pond. I just want to talk quickly about an experiment that we did here. If you take Pier Road down to the water, you'll see that we've constructed a number of seawater tanks. Oops. These tanks were meant to simulate the conditions in the coastal ponds. They're shallow, they're outside, they receive natural daylight, rain. We circulate them, with paddle wheels. We flush them with bay water at 10% a day, and we can manipulate the temperature. So we ran a number of different experiments over the years in which we included seagrass rooted in the bottom. This is a sediment tray with 30 centimeters of marine sediment that we collected and brought to here, lined each of these tanks with that marine sediment, and planted half of the bottom of each of the tanks with seagrass. We performed an experiment where we looked at the effects of adding nutrients and raising temperature on seagrass. And this next result will tell you everything that we know. This is just a time plot of using the ponds as our guide on deciding what the temperatures in the tanks would be. We put a treatment roughly about 2 degrees C above the mean, which is this plot, and 2 degrees below. You can see Dave moving, so it's time to wrap up. So here are 2 treatments. Just look at this first line. This is a line with no nutrients, and this is the cold tank, the ambient tank, and the hot tank. This is seagrass abundance here, the density in shoots. You can see this is the planting density that we initially started the experiment. Lower the temperatures a couple degrees and keep the nutrients out of the tank, and we actually got an increase in seagrass. This is kind of looking back in time. These 2 tanks stayed about the same, no nutrients and at ambient temperatures, and if you increase the temperature slightly, just temperature, you lose about half the plants. In this treatment, we've added nutrients, and you can see that this is without nutrients and with nutrients. You can see that the temperature difference is enough to ameliorate some of the loss. You know, we've lost some plants, but not as bad as when we heat the tank by 2 degrees and add nutrients. One, we completely lost the grass, and the next one we had just a few remnant plants left. So combination of rising temperatures and nutrients is just lethal for seagrass. And this is how it stops growing. It stops producing new leaves. This is a tank that was enriched with nitrogen, and this is a tank that is not. Surprisingly, you would think that this is the better plant situation. But what happens here is the plant has stopped producing new leaves. That mechanism for it to get new chlorophyll tissue out there and produce carbon, and it's elongated it's elongated the leaves that it has. The leaves get long, they become heavily fouled, it's less efficient at capturing sunlight, and the plant eventually dies. And again, this is the control plant. It's just shorter. It has more stock, but it's shorter because it's produced new leaves and dropped off those old leaves that have become fouled. So this is the better condition, obviously. And simply just a summary, we once saw that eelgrass ranged through the entire embayment, that nitrogen enrichment and rising water temperatures stress eelgrass, and when combined, that can be fatal. The stress results in the fact that the plant stops producing new leaf tissue, and that it becomes top heavy. It has a big canopy, so it has a big sail in the water, and not a lot of root mass in the sediment. So when storms come by, they're also inclined to be uprooted and washed away. So between those effects, those spell the end of seagrass in Narragansett Bay. We've obviously dealt with the nitrogen inputs now, and we're just watching what the effect of rising temperatures will be on our populations. That's it.
Thank you, Steve. Will you offer your question?
Sure. I just have a brief question, Steve. Thanks. I think you did a great job explaining kind of the interaction between temperature and nutrients there. Could you speak a little bit to maybe some of the other factors affecting eelgrass growth? I know light penetration is one of them, and how nutrients might play a part in that.
Sure. So in that original picture I showed you, right, in the overflight image of Narragansett Bay, where we saw that outwelling of chlorophyll, of plankton in the Providence River, that's, as the plankton grows, obviously, it makes the water brown or green, depending on those past experiences, and that reduces light to the bottom. And since it's a rooted plant, it really can't move to a better location, so it sits there integrating this loss of light, eventually tipping that balance between production and respiration, so that respiration is greater than its ability to produce new food for itself.
Great. Thank you. We'll get more questions in a minute. Next, we'll have Candace Oviatt.
So, the title of my presentation today is What Happens When Nutrients Are Yeah. So Angelo already showed this graphic, which gives you a time history of how the nutrients have been decreased in the bay. And as you heard from Wally, the nutrients from the early 1900s increased up to about 1950, and then they stayed at more or less asymptotic level up until this nutrient reduction occurred in 2005. So in 2005, the nutrients were reduced from wastewater treatment facilities directly emptying into the bay by 30%. So we went from about 12,000 pounds of nitrogen per day entering the bay down to about 8,000 pounds. And then over several years that was maintained, and then in the summer of 2012, there was a further reduction to achieve a 50% reduction of nitrogen input to the bay from wastewater treatment facilities. That's not quite the whole story because the phosphorus in the bay has been decreased since the 1990s when we started to take phosphate out of detergents. So as of now, we have nitrogen in 2012 decreased by 50%, and also phosphorus has been decreased by 50%. And it's even better than that because the wastewater treatment plants in the watershed have also instituted treatments to reduce nitrogen, and so the total decrease was higher than the goal of 50%. It's closer to 60%. And of course, these nitrogen and phosphate nutrients are responsible for all plant growth, grasses, trees, and phytoplankton. Since 2005, we've had a grant to look at the nutrients in the bay. The numbered stations on here, there's about 13 of them, are places where we took samples, surface water samples for all species of nutrients every month during the colder months and every 2 weeks during the warmer months. The lettered stations here are the locations of our fixed site and buoy monitoring network for water quality. So we have sensors at these sites for temperature, salinity, oxygen, chlorophyll, and pH. And most of these sensors are both surface and bottom. And using that data, I can calculate primary production. So here are the results of our nutrient sampling. The y-axis here is the concentration of nutrient in micromole, and along the x-axis here we have different species, and we're looking at the period before the nutrient reduction and after the nutrient reduction. And for total nitrogen, ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, total phosphate, and dissolved inorganic phosphate, all of these nutrients have been decreased by between 50 and 60%. A very dramatic change, and slightly more than the goal of 50%. So the impact of that has been to decrease primary production in the bay. This shows a gradient of stations from the north of the bay: Bullock's Reach, Connecticut Point, Mount Hope Bay, North Prudence, Greenwich Bay, Sally Rock, Mount View, which is the mouth of Greenwich Bay, Poppasquash in the Upper East Passage, Quonset Point, T Wharf at the south end of Prudence Island, and GSO Dock. And I'll bring your attention to the final column here, where we're looking at the rates of primary reduction prior to the nutrient reduction in 2004 to afterwards in 2013 to 15. And in the upper bay, we see the most dramatic reductions of minus 44 and 45%. And at higher up in the bay, at Bullock's Reach, the decrease is 31%, and down here at Poppasquash, it's also 31%. You'll notice here that Greenwich Bay did not decrease so much, minus 12%. Sorry. So there's still other nutrient inputs to Greenwich Bay, and it's still a very enriched embayment. And this is probably true for some of the other embayments around the bay as well. So the overall average decrease in primary production in the bay is on the order of 33%, I guess that's one way to get your attention. About 30% reduction in primary production in the bay. So one of the consequences has been a decrease in summer chlorophyll. This is a measure of phytoplankton biomass. And the y-axis here is chlorophyll in micrograms per liter. This is a measure of phytoplankton biomass. And we're looking at a period of time before the nutrient drawdown, during the nutrient drawdown, and after the nutrient drawdown. You can see there's a very substantial decrease from before the nutrient drawdown to during the nutrient drawdown. And actually it didn't go down so much further during the 20% increase in 2012. So this is a decrease of phytoplankton biomass in the water column. And that was summertime, and this is wintertime. Now we're looking at the winter-spring bloom during January, February, March. And this is, again, the y-axis is the amount of chlorophyll in the water column. And we're looking at a gradient down the bay from Connecticut Point, Greenwich Bay, T-Wharf, and GSO. And I think you can see that the winter-spring bloom has decreased dramatically at Connecticut Point up at the mouth of the Providence River. It's decreased very dramatically at T-Wharf at the south end of Prudence Island, and it's decreased very dramatically at GSO. It has not decreased in Greenwich Bay. We still have a very substantial winter-spring bloom in Greenwich Bay. So how does this change the ecology of the bay? When we have a bay with a huge winter-spring bloom during a period of high nutrients, the bloom lasts for several weeks. It's a very cold time of the bay, so nothing is grazing material and it sinks to the bottom. And that results in a high biomass of bottom animals, including crabs and lobsters and demersal fish. The signature fish here is the winter flounder. Without that bloom, and during warm winters, or in the present case of low nutrients, we have a short, non-extensive, in some years there's actually no bloom at all. And so there's very low input of organic matter to the benthos. If there is a bloom, it's getting eaten in the water column by the zooplankton community. So that enhances the water column community. The consequence of that is we have a lower biomass benthos, but we have pelagic fish dominating in the water column. And in recent years, we've had a large influx of particularly scup into the bay. So we have a lot more pelagic fish in the bay. So with that decrease of chlorophyll in the bay, both summer and winter, we have a big increase in water clarity. The graph here is extinction coefficient, a measure of the amount of light getting into the water column, versus a period of time, 1997 before the nutrient reduction, 2006 to 9 during, and 2014 after. And what you see here is a big increase in water clarity in the Providence River area and also in the upper bay area. Not so much in the lower bay or the mid-bay area. So what we have now is a water clarity of the lower and upper bay, which is very similar. And if you've been out on the bay at all, you'll probably notice that increase in water clarity. And in summary, the nutrients in the bay have been decreased by 50%, actually over 50%. Primary production in the bay has decreased on the order of 30%. And the winter-spring diatom bloom has been decreased both due to warmer winters, which means that the water column dominates the production of the bloom, and also now due to reduced nutrients. So as a result, we have much greater water clarity, and particularly in the upper bay area. And thank you.
Sure, thanks. So I guess I'll try to provide a segue into the group discussion. Candace, it seems like what you've presented kind of jives with what we were hearing from our first panel and their observations of late. And we heard terms like dead bay, but really talking about the last few years and drastic observations of water clarity, and it seems to go along with what you're presenting.
It's not a dead bay.
Right, so I guess that would be my question. We also heard the question posed, is there enough food? So I guess my question would be, it seems like you are observing a decrease in primary productivity, but from this, can we answer that question, is there enough food? And if not, what more information do we need to collect?
Yeah, let me try. I'll try to answer that. I have a couple of slides on here. The question you're all probably interested in is, are there fewer fish in the bay? And I don't think so, but let me tell you why that is. We had a very dramatic decrease in the bottom community in the bay, the decapods in the bay, the cancer crabs, the lobster crabs. And that started in the 1990s. And that decrease by 2005 to 14 during the nutrient drawdown was on the order of 81%. And it hasn't increased. So decapods have basically left the bay. And I think that's a huge research question on why that has happened. And the answers are out there in the literature to some extent. Rick Welney thinks it's temperature, and a lot of other people think it could be also predation. So a decrease in the bottom community, decapods and crabs. So I looked at the fish biomass from the Rhode Island DEM trawls after that decapod decrease, and that was accomplished by 2009. So this is data from after 2009. So the dark bars are from 2009 to 2012, and the lighter bars are from 2013 to 16 after the nutrient drawdown. And in many areas of the bay, the upper bay, for example, Ohio Ledge, it looks like fish have increased. And in some other areas, like Hope Island, they haven't changed at all. In many areas of the lower bay, there appears to be a slight decrease. It's on the order of 10%, and it's in the lower bay where the nutrients haven't changed that much. The decrease is statistically significant, but the driver is not. And overall, a 10% change in fish with a huge variability of fish in the bay over time, it's not a very large change. The big change has been the change in the decrease in the size of the bottom community, the decapods. The cancer crabs primarily have been a big loss of biomass in the bay. So that was a long answer to your question.
Great, thank you, Candace.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes for questions here, so Anna?
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions, actually. The first one is about kind of spatial patterns in productivity throughout the bay. So we know that Narragansett Bay is an estuary. Water comes in primarily through the East Passage, out through the West Passage. Are there differences in the productivity reduction in the East and West Passage? I would assume that you would see a greater reduction in productivity with nutrient reductions in the West Passage, which is where most of that water is leaving the bay. Have you seen that change? My second question is about kind of the other end of the trophic system of top-down effects. So we have a few emerging species that could have a substantial impact on our fish communities, black sea bass, Jonah crab, to name a few, that have been emerging substantially in the last 5 years. Wondering your thoughts on that versus the top or bottom-up effects.
So differences between the East and West Passage. Not so much. It's more a north-south change in the amount of productivity in the bay. It is true in general that the East Passage has a somewhat lower productivity than the West Passage. You're correct in that, but the big change is from north to south in the bay. Yeah. And the other question, the emerging species in the bay, like black sea bass, or really the fish that has surged into the bay or increased in the bay as a result of the decrease in decapods has been scup. And scup have increased very dramatically in the bay. You're also correct, the black sea bass has increased to some extent. And they indeed have, to some extent, the scup particularly, replaced the biomass. Not totally, it's not as much as it was, but decreased that biomass loss in decapods, cancer crabs.
Do we have any?
I don't know about the increase of Jonah crabs in the bay. I don't think that that that's been very much?
They are. It's been exponential in the past few years in the GSO and the DEM survey. So they're kind of refilling that niche. My question more is about consumption, of whether there are impacts from the other end of the food chain that are impacting these changes in abundance. So particularly predator-prey relationships.
The decapods feed on the bottom on other crustaceans and bivalves. The fish increasing the bay are feeding on those same food sources, so they've kind of taken advantage of that increase in prey species. So that's led to a large increase, and not just scup, actually, it's all fish species. Yeah. By the way, Jeremy Colley is going to talk more about this in the afternoon today, and I also have a poster over there on this issue.
I have a question for Steve. Steve, you mentioned that temperature is a big factor on the eelgrass. Why is Tampa Bay such a success story with the restoration of their eelgrass? I'm sure it's a little warmer down there than it is up here.
I'm sorry? Where are you referring to?
Tampa Bay?
Oh, Tampa Bay.
It's a
Sure,
great success story.
It is a success story. Well, I'll tell you that I believe that the southern populations of eelgrass are probably more heat tolerant. You know, they've developed that ability over time. And we've looked into some of that. We've tried to look at the ability of our own local stocks to resist temperature. So I think that's the future, is that, we're looking for these genetically disposed plants that are better suited to deal with the heat. And again, I think, the isolation of individual beds along the East Coast and the West Coast has made them into individual populations which either fertilize themselves or just exchange genetic information in a small area.
So maybe Jeremy will talk later about how the winter flounder and scup have been dancing up and down in terms of dominance for decades. And we have a particularly valuable data set in Narragansett Bay. It's a really precious data set that can show that because we have that length of time. One thing I'm wondering, though, is given changes in temperature and the fact that these things have gone up and down, it's difficult to assign causality to what's going on. So another way to look at it, if the temporal data is problematic, is to look and see what's going on in other geographic areas. So I don't know whether we've done any of that or whether these same sorts of things are happening in other places where the nutrients have not decreased, and whether we can get any information from that.
Rick Walney has been looking at the decrease of lobsters, particularly along a gradient from here up to Maine. And he has found that the water temperatures in the bay now exceed 20 degrees for large portions of the summer compared to historically. And he believes that that is a stress on lobsters. I'm not so sure it's a stress on cancer crabs in the bay. And the other thing he has found is that there is a gradient of predators, and that down here in southern New England, we have a lot more predators than are present in the Gulf of Maine. So he thinks that that has led to the explosion of lobsters in Maine, and they're currently worried about how these predators might be moving northward.
About a nutrient level, it seems we did larvae distribution at one of our meetings, and the upper bay provided the seed source for the entire bay. And going into the lower bay, I'm wondering if the nitrogen reduction in the upper bay is causing not as much seed and larvae to be produced by the main source, and that's why we're not seeing down bay production in the lower bay. We really haven't had a good set for a dozen years. So I was wondering if there's a causal effect between the health of the upper bay areas, shellfish, and nutrient reduction and their ability to produce enough seed to seed the bay like they did in years past.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But we should remember that the the nutrients in the bay are still about 3 times higher than historically before the colonists came to Rhode Island. So it's still very elevated compared to pre-colonial times. It was 4 or 5 times elevated, now it's about 3 or so times elevated. So there's still a lot of nutrients relative to historical times. As far as how that may have changed, how well shellfish set in the bay, I can't answer, but there may be other folks here in the audience that can help you with that.
Does anybody on this side of the room have a question? Because it's all been over here.
Candace, I was wondering if you could just put in perspective the nitrogen loading coming from wastewater treatment plants versus the total nitrogen loading into the bay.
Yeah. The anthropogenic inputs into the bay have really dominated the amount of nitrogen and phosphate in the bay, and they still do. There is some nutrients that come in from the deep water from offshore, and there's some nutrients that come in from the watershed. And in other times when agriculture was a bigger activity in the area, that was probably also a source of nutrients. But at this time, the wastewater treatment facilities are still the major source of nutrients to the bay, I believe.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Right down here in front.
Candace, is the sediment resuspension make any effect on the nutrients, or is that all refractory organic matter that we have in the bay?
That's a really good question. The nutrient regeneration used to be much higher when we had a bigger winter-spring bloom, which sequestered that organic matter into the sediment. And with the lack of that organic input in the wintertime, we have a reduced flux of nutrients back to the water column in the summertime. Some of the work that Wally's done and Scott Nixon has done has shown that very clearly, and work by Lindsay Fields as well. That is still a process that's going on. The benthos still does remineralize nutrients and feed it back to the water column, but the amount has been reduced by about 50%.
Okay, we have time for 1 more question. Where will it come from? Back over there.
This is a question, I guess, for all of you, but do you think we're at the right level of nutrients in the bay, or should we be higher, lower? What's your opinion?
We don't know. and to some extent, you have to tell us. When your oysters are still growing well, I think that's a good sign. Sometimes some of the fish that have left the bay, like the winter flounder, haven't left because of reduced nutrients. They left because of a warmer temperature. Some of the new fish in the bay are here also because of the warmer temperature. So the bay is always changing. I've never known an average year in Narragansett Bay. So every year is different and it's new. And whether we like it or not, it's going to keep changing. So we just try to keep track of it and tell you what's going on as well as we can.
Okay, let's give the panel a round of applause and thank them. And Jen McCann has a message before lunch, but I want to add one too. Part of what she is requesting is people work on research questions. And one of the things I would like you to add to the research question part is really, what is your goal? What is your goal for the bay? What is your vision for the bay? Because that really will dictate which research questions will go forward. So, Jen?
Great, thanks. So Dave's giving out homework too. So could the resource people and the graduate students come up, please, who are going to be helping me during lunch? And all of you need to listen to this, because remember, there's no free lunch, right? We're giving you a lunch, but we're asking you some questions. So, can you pass these out to the resource users, the people, Angelo and Jean Corliss on there? So, so first of all, could you all sort of introduce yourself? If you could stand like here, and could we turn off the projector? Melvin, could we turn the projector? So, Lanny, why don't, we know you, right? You're a fisherman. That's right. Right. Matt, we know you, right?
I think so.
Okay. Bruce, can you say who, we know who you are, right?
I'm Bruce Corliss. I am a paleoceanographer, geological oceanographer.
Okay, great. Angelo, we know you. Okay, we all know Sally, right? Joe?
I'm Joe Langen. I'm a PhD student in biological oceanography here at GSO, as well as a master's student in statistics in Jeremy Collins' lab.
Okay, Mike?
My name is Mike Laptu. I've been diving in Rhode Island for over 50 years, and I'm an underwater videographer and photographer and outdoor writer.
I'm Corinne Truesdale. I'm a master's student in marine affairs and in oceanography with Jeremy Colley.
Hi, I'm Anna Roebuck. I am a PhD candidate in Reiner Lohman's lab. I look at environmental pollutants in the bay.
Hi everyone, I'm Allie Johnson. I'm a PhD student in physical oceanography, and I work for Melissa Oman.
Kevin Rosa. I'm also doing physical oceanography with Chris and Kate.
Thank you. So we have 5 pairs of people, all right? And they're going to be placed over either in the hazard room or the large conference room where we're having lunch. And so what I'm asking you all is, once you're thinking about lunch, when you're thinking about lunch and you have a research question, or you have something that you really want to know more about Narragansett Bay, and or, you know, again, Dave just challenged you to tell us what you want the bay to be like. What is your vision for the bay? To go over to one of those pairs, and again, there's a lot of students here. The pairs are, you know, look at the resource users, and go and talk to them and have a conversation about what your research question is. Now, I know these people, they all look the same, you know, they're all one of us and whatnot, so how many of you have pie holes? Right? Okay, good. So would you guys please open up your piece of paper? So what we're doing is we're giving each one of these people a pie, all right? And if you go and talk to them and you come up with a good question, they will give you a piece of pie. All right? So now...
No pie for you.
Each pie has about 8 pieces, unless you would like to be creative. So not everybody gets a piece of pie, all right? You got to be assertive, creative, you got to, you know, snap it up here. So, Lanny, what kind of pie did you get? Blueberry. Matt?
Chocolate cream.
Okay. Chocolate cream.
Apple.
Apple. And Mike?
Blueberry.
Blueberry. Okay, good. And here is a picture of the apple. Okay. All right. So we are going to send them over because they get to cut the lunch line. So why don't you guys go? And they will assimilate themselves. We will be back here at 1:30. All right. So you have a little bit more time. There's also a poster.